The fleet was there, and then it wasn't. Hundreds of ships, the pride of the Knights Templar, dispatched, dissolved, or disappeared. No wreckage, no cargo, no survivors, not even a single oar washing up along the coast. They didn't sink, they didn't return, they didn't leave a note, and no one has found them since. It's as if the sea opened its arms and swallowed a secret so enormous no empire dared ask where it went. Until now. But you're not here for thunder and fire. You're here because something whispered. A soft ripple on still water. A name half said in a forgotten book. You're not chasing an answer, you're following a trail. And now that trail leads west, into the fog. You close your eyes and listen. Masts creak in the night wind. Salt clings to your skin. Somewhere in the dark, waves slap against a hull heavy with gold or relics or something even older than myth. The year is 1307, and you're standing on the docks of La Rochelle, France. Behind you, torches flicker beneath the stone towers of the city. Ahead of you lies the Atlantic. And anchored at the edge of that ancient world is the most formidable fleet Europe has ever known. Templar ships, tall and lean black against the moonlight, trimmed in red crosses. This wasn't some merchant convoy or petty crusader flotilla. These were vessels of war and wealth, precision crafted over decades, fueled by trade routes, papal favors, and something deeper, something the French crown couldn't buy. And the church couldn't touch. Secrets wrapped in oak and iron riding the tides of 2 continents. And then nothing. History tells us what happened on land. On October 13th, 1307, Friday the 13th, yes, really, King Philip IV of France launched a coordinated, ruthless crackdown on the Knights Templar. Arrests, confessions under torture flames, licking at the edges of parchment and flesh alike. That part they recorded well, but the fleet silent. Not even the chroniclers could pretend they knew where it went. You might assume it was destroyed. Yet there are no reports of naval battles, no tales of storms, no cargo found bobbing in the surf. The fleet, dozens if not hundreds of ships, simply slipped the leash of recorded time. It left behind no bones, no sails, no timber. It left behind only questions. And here's the strangest part, nobody really went looking. Not seriously. It was as though the world wanted to forget that an order with that much maritime muscle had vanished on the very night its leaders were captured. Why, that's what we're going to uncover together. Not with loud declarations, but with quiet footsteps. One harbor at a time. One monastery, one ruined chapel, one whisper of a map drawn too early. You'll trace the lines of forgotten coastlines. Feel your way through shadows thicker than night. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find what's been missing since that October dawn. But let's get one thing straight. This isn't just about ships. This is about power, sacred and profane. It's about the delicate difference between erasure and escape. It's about why sometimes to truly survive, you must disappear. So settle in. Let the sea take you. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You feel it first as weight. Not physical, but the kind of pressure that comes from secrets too large to name. The Templar fleet wasn't just a navy, it was a vault, a whisper, a warning. Its disappearance wasn't only mysterious, it was purposeful. Because what vanished wasn't merely wood and sailcloth. It was what those ships carried, what they represented, and what they threatened to expose. The Knights Templar were by 1307 more than holy warriors. They were Europe's most powerful transnational bank. They held lands across the continent, tax privileges from the Pope himself, and access to ports from Acre to Aragon. But their most valuable asset was trust. Monarchs and merchants alike entrusted the Templars with fortunes. That kind of financial sway gave them leverage far beyond what even the Vatican comfortably tolerated. And when King Philip IV of France found himself drowning in debt after costly wars with England and Flanders, he turned to the Templars' vaults, only to be met with quiet refusal. There's a reason that during the arrests, Philip didn't only seize knights, he sent men to search for ledgers, for scrolls, for maps. The crown knew the wealth wasn't in piles of gold hidden beneath the temple in Paris. It was mobile, movable, somewhere offshore. That's why the fleet mattered. This wasn't just about moving cargo from port to port. The Templar ships functioned as armored banks capable of relocating treasuries in a matter of days. Unlike land-based strongholds, a fleet could scatter, vanish, or sail to welcoming shores beyond any king's reach. And that meant, when the arrests came, there was more than time, there was motive. Some historians dismiss the scale of Templar maritime holdings, painting them as marginal compared to the grandeur of later navies. But such assessments often rely on royal naval records, precisely the places where the Templars operating in semi-clerical autonomy were rarely mentioned. Yet merchants in the Mediterranean reported sailing alongside Templar vessels, and pilgrims routinely booked passage aboard their ships. These weren't ghost boats. They were a shadow network known to those who needed them and invisible to those who might destroy them. And then there are the relics. It's easy now to scoff at the idea of a chalice or a scrap of cloth changing the fate of kingdoms. But in 1307, relics weren't just sacred, they were currency. The Templars were rumored to possess many: a shard of the True Cross, the lance of Longinus, even whispers of a head bearded mummified called Baphomet by their accusers worshipped in candlelit rituals. Whether real or invented by inquisitors, the stories gave the Templars an aura of forbidden power. Something more than money. Something that needed to be hidden at all costs. Which leads to a controversial suggestion. What if the fleet wasn't only evacuating wealth and people, but knowledge? The Templars weren't monks in the classic sense, but they were literate, organized, and deeply connected to networks of scholars, builders, and astrologers. During the Crusades, they encountered Arabic texts on navigation, mathematics, and astronomy that hadn't yet filtered into Europe. Some believe they copied and preserved these. Others whisper of stranger things, untranslated scrolls, coded diagrams, and proto-cartographic sketches of lands beyond the known world. And so when the order crumbled, there was far more at stake than gold. The records of Philip's raids mention the urgency with which some Templar houses burned their own archives. Scribes fled or vanished. Documents were deliberately destroyed. But a few clerks under torture spoke of advance warnings, of horses disappearing in the night, of ships leaving under moonlight. These aren't firm proof, of course. But the pattern repeats a sense that some within the order knew the hammer was coming and made preparations. And where better to store the untraceable than aboard ships? Of course, this theory raises questions that historians continue to debate and often dismiss. If the Templars were so prepared, why was the fleet never officially recorded as having left La Rochelle? Why weren't there sightings along the usual trade routes? Wouldn't someone somewhere have written down such a dramatic escape? But perhaps they did, and the writing was simply erased. We'll come to that. For now, consider this: the Templars had the means, the motive, and the time to flee. They had a fleet that could carry not just men, but entire libraries, reliquaries, and treasuries. They had ports loyal to them across the western coast of France and beyond. And they had something else, an understanding that to survive meant to vanish, That knowledge might have come from bitter experience. In earlier crusades, they had seen cities fall overnight. They had watched holy relics carted off as trophies. They had seen kings turn their swords inward when foreign enemies grew too distant. The writing had been on the wall for years, and the fleet was their contingency plan. It's easy to forget as you drift back toward La Rochelle in your mind that hiding isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's the only way to keep power from falling into the wrong hands. And sometimes it's the only way to preserve the truth. Behind you, the city is stirring. Word of the arrests has begun to spread. Horses clatter on cobblestones. Torches hiss against damp stone. But at the docks, the mooring lines are gone. The ships that once groaned under the weight of Europe's unspoken past are no longer anchored. They have slipped away. Quietly. Perfectly. As if they were never there at all. You can almost taste the chill in the air, the tang of salt and iron hanging over the port of La Rochelle on the eve of October 12, 1307. The sky bruises purple at dusk, heavy with autumn's breath, as gulls cry warnings no one understands. The city, one of the most strategic ports on the Atlantic coast, is unusually still. Ships bob in the harbor, Templar banners rustling faintly in the wind. A single bell tolls from the fortress tower, and somewhere inland hooves strike stone in rhythm too precise to be coincidence. Because this was no ordinary night. The French king's orders had already been signed, sealed, whispered into the ears of sheriffs and bailiffs, bishops and spies. Every corner of France was about to erupt in a coordinated strike against the most powerful religious military order in Europe. But here on the western edge of the continent, the fleet remained silent and patient like chess pieces waiting to be swept from the board or played in a final desperate move. Records from the royal court show that Philip IV had been planning the mass arrest of the Templars for months, maybe longer. But there's something odd and edge a tension in the timing. The official orders went out just days before the strike. Yet reports from royal agents on the coast indicate that some of the Templar ships had already departed La Rochelle before the warrants were executed. Not all, but enough to raise suspicion. Enough to imply foreknowledge. So the question lingers, who warned them? There are two names that often surface, though always with a haze of ambiguity. The first is Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's ruthless advisor and enforcer. His fingerprints are everywhere on the operation. But some argue Nogaret's own ambition might have included contingency plans in case the Templars fought back. Could he have leaked the timeline to preserve leverage? The second name is Pope Clement V himself, caught in a tug-of-war between king and knight. While publicly complicit in the arrests, Clement hesitated, delayed, and vacillated. Might he have sent a quiet messenger westward, a final act of betrayal or mercy? Either way, the result was the same. Ships disappeared from the manifest. Notably, one chronicler from a nearby monastery writing weeks later described seeing a line of sails slipping into the gray morning fog 2 days before the crackdown. He assumed it was a merchant convoy. Yet Templar vessels were known to sail in deliberate silence, and some of the order's best navigators were stationed at La Rochelle. A fleet of this size moving under cover of twilight wouldn't be impossible. It would be genius. Some point to a surviving entry in the records of La Rochelle itself. A brief, almost lazy note scribbled without emphasis about harbor activity on the 11th 10 ships, unflagged, but known weighed anchor at dawn. No stated destination. This might be meaningless, but given what followed, that bland observation becomes a scream in the dark. Here's the complication. By the 12th, the fleet should have been there. Witnesses later claimed that by morning on the 13th, the day of the arrests, the harbor was virtually empty of Templar ships. Some said the vessels had left to transport grain or supplies to other commanderies. Others insisted they were moved inland due to foul weather warnings. A few in hushed tones believed they sailed for England or Ireland, carrying not food, but treasure. And still, none of them were found. It's a fact historians acknowledge but often gloss over. No detailed inventory of the Templar fleet at La Rochelle has survived. We can estimate its size through cross-reference trade logs, donation records, and port taxes, but not a single master ledger of ships remains. Either none was ever kept, or it was deliberately destroyed, and that in itself is revealing. Consider the atmosphere within the Templar ranks in the weeks before the arrests. While the knights on land may have grown complacent, believing themselves too holy or too essential to be targeted, the mariners, many of whom were lay brothers or hired sailors, were rarely so naive. The seas taught pragmatism. The whispers of politics blew with the wind, and those working the docks would have seen the signs. More than once, scribes note unseasonal activity around the Templar warehouses. Carts coming and going at odd hours. Scrolls packed alongside food and wine. One account mentions a small crate nailed shut marked with a crimson serpent. Another recalls a locked chest handed off to a knight who bore no crest, vanishing into the shadows without a word. What were they moving? Wealth, perhaps? Or something that couldn't be allowed to fall into royal hands? And if so, why wasn't there a mass panic? This is the heart of the scholarly debate. Some argue there was no coordinated evacuation, that the fleet's disappearance was fragmented, accidental, the result of chaotic reactions by individual commanders. Others suggest the entire operation was scripted like a play, orchestrated escape routes, decoy ships, and destination ports already primed to receive them. One intriguing clue comes from a Templar commandery in western Brittany. In a letter dated October 10th, only discovered centuries later in a private archive, it refers to preparations for the transfer of inventory to Iberian custody and mentions night sails under pre-arranged light. The phrase has baffled translators, but its tone is unmistakably covert. Iberian custody, could this be an early hint at the Portuguese connection? We'll explore later. But for now, the scene remains here with you on the edge of the docks. The town is asleep or pretending to be. The castle lights are dimmed. The fleet is already gone or slipping away one by one. No alarms. No pursuit. Just the soft flap of canvas and the hush of waves against stone, and the knowledge, quiet and heavy, that something vast is changing before dawn. You step back from the water's edge, your boots slick with mist, and turn toward the inland road. Somewhere out there, riders gallop toward Templar manors. Arrests await. Torture. Fire. Betrayal. But at sea, only silence. You drift now through an age when Europe still believed its maps were whole. Before telescopes, before compass roses dotted every corner of a globe, there was the sea, a boundary and a bridge. And into that watery uncertainty, the Knights Templar launched not just ships, but a vision. Not of conquest necessarily, but of movement, of control, and of freedom. Their fleet was not born overnight. It rose from necessity, forged in the fires of the Crusades and sharpened by trade. At first, the order had no maritime ambitions. They were founded as protectors of pilgrims, not merchants or navigators. But protection in time demanded transportation, and transportation demanded ships. With every port they landed in, with every favor granted by pope or prince, the Templars built a web, one that stretched from the dusty docks of Acre to the windswept harbors of Brittany. By the late 13th century, they weren't just operating a handful of vessels. They were managing one of the most extensive private maritime networks in Christendom. They understood logistics with almost unsettling clarity. If the French crown excelled at bureaucracy and the Venetian Republic at commerce, the Templars quietly perfected both afloat. They developed a centralized system of commanderies, regional headquarters, that coordinated the movement of goods people and information. These commanderies, especially those near key ports like Marseille, La Rochelle, and Lisbon, acted as loading stations and naval hubs. Ships could be equipped, repaired, or hidden within days. Orders were passed via coded letters, often disguised as religious texts, or written in numeric shorthand to avoid interception. A popular image of Templars shows armored knights riding into battle beneath a blood-red cross. Less iconic but equally powerful is the image of these same men calculating grain reserves in Acre, weighing gold in Antioch, or plotting courses through the Strait of Gibraltar under moonlight. They trained in finance as rigorously as in arms. It's no surprise that their ships didn't carry soldiers alone. They carried scribes, masons, engineers, even early physicians. These weren't just vessels of war. They were floating command centers. One confirmed historical fact illustrates the breadth of their operations. In 1291, after the fall of Acre, the Templars coordinated one of the largest organized naval evacuations in medieval history. With the city surrounded and burning, they used their fleet to ferry not just knights, but civilians, archives, and relics to safety. Few fleets of the time could match that kind of rapid response. Fewer still could have done so without needing royal permission. Which brings us to one of the more obscure details, the Templar use of dual flagging. To reduce the risk of piracy or interference, many of their ships sailed under secular banners, those of local noble houses, or even neutral merchant guilds. In theory, this allowed them to blend in to masquerade as harmless traders. In practice, it also gave them flexibility to navigate ports that may have been hostile to the order. Some of their vessels reportedly bore Genoese or Catalan colors, despite having no connection to those republics. One Templar ship confiscated in Cyprus was found to carry forged letters of passage from 3 different kingdoms, each sealed in wax and each bearing contradictory instructions. Whether this was deception or diplomacy is still debated. Historians agree on the fleet's capacity, but they argue over its intent. Were the Templars building a maritime empire in secret, or were they merely leveraging ships to support their land-based holdings? Some believe the answer lies in the subtle shifts in their priorities during the final decades of the order. Records from Templar archives show a growing investment in coastal commanderies. Trade agreements with North African ports increase. There's a spike in cargo manifests listing spices, textiles, and salt items not required by soldiers, but beloved by merchants. More curiously, notes from internal ledgers reference cargo of uncertain value or relocations for the preservation of our aims, phrasing vague enough to spark entire fields of conspiracy. And here's where the debate sharpens. Some scholars argue this was mere diversification. After all, the fall of the Holy Land forced the Templars to rethink their role. With no clear war to fight, their ships naturally turned to commerce. Others see something more deliberate, a pivot toward autonomy. With their own navy, their own bankers, their own message couriers, the Templars were drifting ever closer to becoming a sovereign force answerable to neither pope nor king. It is this independence, perhaps, that sealed their fate. You remember now from the quiet of a previous chapter, the crates moved in darkness at La Rochelle. The ones marked not with crosses but symbols, serpents, stars, towers. You think back to the mention of night sails under prearranged light. Who else could operate with such precision except those who had rehearsed it for decades? By the time Philip IV turned his eye to the Templars, their fleet was already an enigma. Their routes weren't always listed in port records. Their cargo wasn't always declared. Their ships weren't even always recognized. And that confusion, that plausible deniability, wasn't sloppiness. It was strategy. A knight may be brave, but a sailor must be clever. And the Templar fleet was clever in the extreme. Crewed by men of mixed nationalities, fluent in Latin, Arabic, Occitan, and the code of the wind. They could sail at night without lanterns. They could vanish into fishing convoys or take refuge in monastic islands far off the trade routes. They didn't need harbors, they could anchor in coves known only to them. It's no wonder, then, that when the order collapsed, no one could find the fleet. It had been built not just to transport, but to elude. You stand again in your imagination at the cliff above La Rochelle. Far below, waves churn in ceaseless rhythm. Somewhere beyond that horizon, something waits, not just a mystery, but a legacy of motion, concealment, and control. A fleet worth hiding. And even more, a fleet that knew exactly how to hide itself. The stone beneath your feet is wet with centuries. You trace the weathered curve of the old pier at La Rochelle, where weeds now twist through ancient cracks and seagulls argue above the battlements. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it: ropes, tightening barrels, rolling the dull thud of boots against oak planks. For a moment, time folds, and you're standing in the very place the last Templar fleet was ever seen. La Rochelle wasn't just any port. It was the keystone. The Templars had holdings in dozens of coastal towns, but La Rochelle was the crown jewel, both fortress and gateway, nestled snug between the politics of Paris and the yawning mouth of the Atlantic. Its natural harbor, deep and protected, made it ideal for launching long voyages. And its Templar-controlled quays gave them a rare thing in medieval Europe: discretion. While other orders relied on royal ports and permissions, the Templars built their own dockyards, their own warehouses, even their own customs houses. Here they could load a ship in total secrecy. No prying bailiff, no meddling merchant guild, just loyal hands, trained eyes, and silence. And it was here that the fleet was last confirmed. One well-established fact stands out. In early 1307, La Rochelle was actively provisioning a group of Templar vessels under the supervision of Humbert Blanc, the regional preceptor. Surviving documents, some embedded in property records, others scrawled into the margins of later legal disputes, describe deliveries of grain-salted fish wax and weaponry to the Templar docks. These weren't local shipments. These were maritime stores meant for serious travel. Long-range, high-value travel. But then the records stop, and that's not just poetic. It's literal. In the weeks immediately following the October arrests, all official mention of Templar maritime activity in La Rochelle ceases. No port fees, no transfer notes, no ship repairs or anchor permits. It's as if the fleet and its infrastructure simply evaporated. What happened to those dock workers? To the clerks who tracked the manifests? Some were arrested, but many just disappear from the pages. Historians chalk it up to war, to chaos, to bureaucratic failure. But there's a chilling counter-theory that those who handled the last ships were silenced. Not by violence necessarily, but by oath, by fear, or by gold. There is a peculiar footnote buried in the regional annals of the time. A monk from nearby Saintes, writing in late November 1307, mentions that no ship of the temple hath returned, nor sent message, though the port lay open to them. It reads like a lament, or perhaps an observation from someone who expected them back. And that expectation, that's what makes La Rochelle more than a point on a map. It makes it a launch pad. but launched where some legends say west toward the fog. Others suggest northward into English channels. Still others speak of southbound sails vanishing into Iberia. No definitive account survives, but tantalizing hints cling like barnacles. There's an obscure detail that continues to fascinate fringe scholars. In a private letter from a disgraced former Templar knight, now preserved in a church archive in Bruges, the writer cryptically refers to the great parting at the Silver Mouth, believed by some to describe the moment the fleet divided into smaller squadrons at the mouth of the Charente River near La Rochelle. If true, this would suggest a plan, a deliberate dispersal, rather than a panicked flight. And that's the center of ongoing scholarly debate. Was this a real escape or a myth we built around a bureaucratic black hole? Some argue that the absence of documentation doesn't prove movement, that the fleet may have already been gone, dismantled, sold, or rotting in harbor. But if that were the case, why did no one claim the ships? Why did no king seize them as spoils? Maritime historians note that such vessels, if abandoned, would have been quickly repurposed by local powers. Yet no record of such transfer exists. No cargo, no confiscated sails, no lawsuits over ship ownership. Just absence. And that absence has made La Rochelle a magnet for theories. Modern archaeological surveys of the area have turned up nothing definitive. No sunken hulls in the bay, no buried docks. But there are unexplained anomalies. A cluster of carved stones near the southern seawall bears the Templar cross worn nearly flat by wind, and one stone is etched with a date interpreted as September 12th, that would place it exactly 1 month before the arrests. The implication, a marker, possibly even a deadline. Of course, these stones could mean nothing, but when viewed alongside the sudden provisioning surge, the vanishing port records, and the eerie silence in royal dispatches, they begin to whisper louder. One thing is certain, after La Rochelle, the trail goes cold. No other port claims to have received the fleet. No chronicler writes of its arrival. And yet ships don't just vanish, especially not ships as well-maintained, as crewed, as mission-ready as the Templars. Something moved them. And that something was almost certainly orchestrated from here. You walk now along the crumbling battlements of the old Tour de la Chaîne, imagining the flicker of torches across the channel. Below, shadowy figures prepare for night sailing. A last crate is hoisted. A final prayer mumbled. Somewhere a captain nods once, signaling a departure centuries in the making. And then they're gone. Into mist. Into myth. And you, standing on the same stones, are left with only the wind. The human eye is not a camera. It doesn't record. It remembers. And memories, like fog, shift when touched. That's the trouble when you ask people what they saw the night the fleet disappeared. Some recall light on the sails, others heard only silence. Some swear they watched ships drift into the dark horizon. Others say the docks were bare long before the stars came out. Fact and fiction moved together like currents weaving around a truth few dared to speak aloud. But speak they did. In the weeks after the arrests of October 1307, scattered reports emerged from the coast near La Rochelle. A fisherman named Loup, in a confession dated mid-November, claimed to have seen a black line of ships low in the tide moving west as the moon dipped. He described the sails as wrapped as though to hide their markings and insisted they left before the king's men arrived. Loup was never seen again. Then there was the traveling monk who passed through the Saintonge countryside just days after the fleet vanished. He wrote in his personal journal, not a formal chronicle, but a travel record, that a stable hand in Rochefort spoke of horses and riders arriving at dawn bearing news that the red-crossed ships had flown. He didn't elaborate. He didn't even seem particularly interested. To him, it was gossip, To us, it's a glimpse. There are more such accounts. Dozens, if not hundreds, have surfaced across the centuries, letters, depositions, family stories scribbled in the margins of old ledgers. A wine merchant's ledger from 1311, unearthed in the cellar of a ruined chateau, notes that the Templar convoy bought no casks this year, gone perhaps like birds before frost. It sounds poetic. But why would a wine trader even note that unless the absence was unusual, the real challenge is sifting what might be genuine from what surely is invention? Take, for example, the tale of the night choir told for generations by villagers in the Vendée region. According to local folklore, on the night of October 12th, a chorus of ghostly voices was heard offshore chanting in Latin, rising in pitch, fading with the tide. The next morning, strange, cross-shaped impressions were found in the sand. It's a haunting story. It's also almost certainly a legend grafted onto real events. But still, there's something about the consistency of these tales. So many of them agree on the same general image: ships leaving quietly, deliberately, under cover of twilight. No battle, no fire, just motion and mist. And then there's the problem of the non-witnesses, the ones who should have spoken, but didn't. La Rochelle was a bustling port. Merchants, sailors, clerics, street hawkers. Yet after October 13th, there is a deafening silence in the surviving documents. For nearly 2 months, nothing in the city's civic records mentions the Templar docks. No taxes collected, no leases transferred, no fines, no disputes, no requisitions. It's as if the part of the city that had once hummed with movement had fallen under a spell of forgetfulness. Some scholars suggest this gap reflects fear. Anyone who had seen or helped the fleet escape risked implication in treason. Best to say nothing. Better still to forget. Others believe there was active suppression, that Philip's agents not only seized property, but confiscated records, paid off informants, and destroyed contradictory evidence. And here's where things get interesting. A letter from a Genoese trader written in early 1308 mentions the sudden disappearance of a fellow merchant who knew too much about what sailed from the French coast last autumn. He doesn't name La Rochelle. He doesn't mention the Templars. But the timing is exact, and the fear palpable. Still, not all accounts were erased. In a remote village near Bordeaux, a church manuscript details a sermon given in early 1308 warning parishioners not to consort with those who sail under stolen banners. The phrase is unusual. It doesn't accuse anyone of piracy, but implies disguise false flags. Ships pretending to be something they're not. Could these have been Templar vessels in hiding, sailing along the coast under merchant colors? That possibility brings us full circle to one of the more obscure eyewitnesses, a young cleric named Arnaud, whose personal notes were found centuries later, sewn into the lining of a psalter. Arnaud had been visiting a monastery near the Gironde estuary. On October 14th, he wrote, a small vessel came ashore before dawn. Men in cloaks disembarked. They bore no arms, but one carried a long chest wrapped in oilcloth. They asked no questions and gave no names. I offered them bread. They paid in foreign coin. Scholars have long debated Arnaud's account. Was it real, a parable, a hallucination? But the detail that stands out is the foreign coin. If true, it suggests the fleeing Templars were already operating beyond French currency, using wealth prepared for a journey far from home. And so we're left with this multiple accounts that agree in tone, if not in detail. Some official, some whispered, some passed down like bedtime stories. A few are likely true. Others are embellished, confused, or outright lies. But all of them swirl around the same hollow space in history, the blank spot where the fleet should be. And isn't that always the way with ghosts? You rarely see them clearly. More often you catch a hint, a flicker, a footstep on the stairs, or in this case, a red cross on a sail fading into fog. The night of the 12th is gone, but you can still feel it, can't you? The way truth lingers just out of reach. The way silence sometimes tells you everything you need to know. It is the quiet that unsettles you most. Not the drama of fire and sword. Not the hammering of hooves or the clatter of armored boots against stone. No, what you notice after the fleet vanishes isn't chaos. It's absence. Like a story that suddenly forgets its own characters. The chapter that follows, October 13th, 1307, is not filled with pursuit or confrontation. It's filled with nothing. And that nothing is deafening. The Templars, once so visible, so loud in parchment and tax and tithe, are suddenly hushed in the records. Not just in La Rochelle, but across France, in Burgundy, in Aquitaine, in Aragon and Flanders. The names stop appearing. Ledgers trail off mid-column. Monasteries that once recorded every Templar shipment to the grain sack now fall silent. And if that were mere accident, you might forgive it. But the pattern is too precise, too complete. So we must ask who turned down the volume. It's a well-established fact that Philip IV's crackdown was more than arrests. It was a systemic purge. The king's agents were not merely seizing men, they were seizing information. Templar treasuries were searched, their libraries rifled, their correspondence confiscated. And then came the trials, public, dramatic, and in truth poorly documented. Many of the surviving transcripts were copied years later, and contradictions riddle the margins. But one thing stands out: very little was said about the fleet. Under torture, Templars confessed to kissing strange idols and spitting on the cross. Some swore they had worshipped Baphomet, or consorted with demons, or performed unspeakable rites. But what you rarely find is mention of ships, of cargo, of plans. Only a handful of testimonies even allude to the fleet, and those that do are vague. One condemned knight, Jean de Chalon, reportedly told his inquisitors that the best of the order fled by sea. He did not say where. He did not name a captain or a destination. But his phrase, "the best," echoes. It implies not cowardice, but selection. That some were chosen to leave, to preserve, or perhaps to hide. This comment, preserved in a fragment of a 14th century account now stored in the Vatican secret archives, is often cited, but just as often dismissed. Some scholars argue it was an invention of later Romanticism. Others note that Jean's execution followed swiftly after his statement, perhaps too swiftly, and still the paper trail grows colder. Where once hundreds of documents tracked the order's operations, suddenly there are gaps. Whole commandery inventories missing. Letters unreadable due to water damage or curiously scorched edges. Royal registers with pages torn out. Even the Vatican's own registry pauses its accounting for weeks in late 1307, offering only the phrase "further inquiries remain pending" before skipping ahead to later decrees. One obscure example, the Cathedral Archive of Angoulême, contains a fragment of parchment that may have been part of a Templar charter. A faint watermark suggests it was part of a set. But the other pages are gone missing since the early 14th century. According to a marginal note in a later hand, the scribe was instructed to remove all traces. The handwriting matches that of a known papal clerk. Is it a smoking gun? No, but it smells like smoke. Even more puzzling is the disappearance of maritime records. You'd expect ports from Galicia to Genoa to show some sign of inbound Templar vessels, but instead there's a dip, a peculiar lull in activity. Between October 1307 and March 1308, several coastal regions reported fewer ship arrivals than usual. Not zero, but fewer. Almost as though something had moved, quietly and deliberately, between the normal lanes. And this is where the open scholarly debate lives: was this absence natural or curated? Traditional historians lean toward chaos theory. They argue that the arrests disrupted everything: trade taxes, church reports. That the silence reflects general disorder, not a deliberate cover-up. But others, more suspicious, more patient, see fingerprints. They see a fleet that didn't just disappear, but was methodically erased. Because erasure is in some ways easier than destruction. Destroy a ship and you leave wreckage, bones, sails adrift, but erase its name from the ledger. Remove the logbook from the archive. Silence the dockmaster with a purse of silver that's cleaner, quieter, and infinitely harder to trace. Of course, we must revisit an earlier detail: the coded nature of Templar communication. Previous chapters hinted at scrolls disguised as sermons, letters masked in Latin hymns, routes whispered and never written. The order was prepared for secrecy, which makes the silence feel purposeful, as if it were not a failure of history, but a design. You stand again in your thoughts beside the cathedral doors of Poitiers, where royal scribes once gathered to catalog seized assets. The heavy wooden doors are scarred, now pitted by time, but in your mind they're newly closed. Behind them, the ink dries on papers never meant to be seen. You imagine a clerk dipping his quill, scratching out names. Not inventing new truths, just quietly removing the old ones. A fleet becomes a footnote. A voyage becomes a rumor. And history loses not in battle but in bureaucracy. There's a final haunting artifact worth noting. A stone tablet recovered from a monastery in western France, broken into 3 pieces and bearing the inscription, "Silentium est salus, nostra silence is our salvation." Was it a prayer, a warning, or the Templar creed for survival? You may never know. But in this absence, in this sudden spreading hush, you begin to feel the shape of something hidden. Not just lost, protected. The sea forgets, they say, but it only forgets what we silence first. The wind shifts, now colder, saltier, tinged with something wild. You've left the controlled docks of La Rochelle behind. Gone are the sun-bleached harbors and the careful hands of Templar quartermasters. Now you follow the current north, where the waters grow rougher and the shores more defiant. Where the rules of kingdoms fade and refuge depends not on law, but on loyalty. Scotland. It seems an unlikely sanctuary for Europe's most hunted brotherhood, yet that's precisely what makes it plausible. In 1307, Scotland was a land at war both against England and within itself. King Edward I of England had ravaged the countryside, but Scottish resistance, led by the emerging figure of Robert the Bruce, burned stubbornly on. It was a time of fractured alliances, of exiled nobles, shifting loyalties, and smoke-thick hills where strangers could disappear without a trace. For men carrying forbidden symbols and dangerous truths, it was not inhospitable. It was perfect. And here's the historical foothold. Scotland uniquely was never included in Pope Clement V's edict to arrest the Templars. While France acted swiftly and ruthlessly, and England followed with icy hesitation, Scotland ignored the papal bulls altogether. The excommunication of Robert the Bruce, after the murder of John Comyn in 1306, had already put the kingdom at odds with Rome. So when Clement's orders came, they carried little authority north of the border. In effect, Scotland became one of the only European regions where the Templars could exist, if quietly, without immediate threat of seizure. That alone is compelling. But the trail does not rest on absence alone. There are rumors, of course. tales that some of the fleet's smaller ships landed on the western coast near Galloway or Argyll. That hooded men disembarked beneath cloud-streaked moonlight and vanished into the forests. That wagons heavy with chests rolled eastward under cover of storm. Most of these stories come from oral tradition ballads, parish yarns, and clan legends passed down like family recipes. You'd be forgiven for dismissing them, and yet a few fragments resist easy dismissal. A 14th-century manuscript housed in the archives of Paisley Abbey mentions a gift of horses and armor from brethren of the temple newly arrived, and eager to serve a just cause. The document is cryptic. It never explicitly names the Knights Templar. But the phrasing brethren of the temple and the date spring of 1308 leave little doubt. Elsewhere carved into a pillar at Rosslyn Chapel, a building later thick with Templar mythology, but itself built nearly a century later, are symbols some believe to predate the structure itself. Crosses, yes, but not the typical ecclesiastical kind. These are more precise, balanced, sharpened like the crosses carved into the keels of Templar vessels. Most scholars agree the marks were recarved during construction, preserving older designs etched into stonework long before. And then there's the infamous Lochaber map, found in a private Scottish collection in the 1800s, showing a series of dotted lines stretching from the Atlantic coast to what appear to be monastic holdings deep in the Highlands. It was quickly denounced as a forgery. But before its disappearance in a fire in 1932, a scholar noted its unusual coordinate notation systems not commonly used in northern cartography until well after the Templar period. Some say it was nonsense. Others say it was knowledge smuggled aboard a ship. It wouldn't be the first time secret knowledge took that route. Recall the whispered claims from earlier chapters of scrolls wrapped in oilcloth of Arabic star charts, copied by Templar scribes of relics and items labeled cargo of uncertain value. If those were meant to survive, they needed a place not only of safety, but of obscurity, and Scotland was nothing if not obscure. What lends weight to this theory isn't just legend, but timing. In the years immediately following the Templar purge, Robert the Bruce's fortunes suddenly shift. After years of struggle, he begins to win. Not small victories, but decisive ones like the Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307, and later the legendary triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. His army was outnumbered, ill-equipped, and cornered, yet somehow it crushed the English. One controversial interpretation suggests he had help, not in armies but in strategy, in logistics, in funding, an influx of trained fighters hardened by the desert wars, suddenly free and with nowhere else to turn. It's pure speculation, of course, but tantalizing. Because in the years after Bannockburn, the Scottish crown recovers astonishingly fast. New castles rise, new trade routes open, and Bruce, once excommunicated and outlawed, begins negotiating on the international stage like a statesman. Coincidence or consequence? Even within academia, the idea that Templars helped shape post-purge Scotland is no longer entirely fringe. A growing number of historians argue that if nothing else, small groups of fleeing knights likely found refuge with sympathetic Scottish lords, especially those already in conflict with England, especially those who had everything to gain from aiding enemies of the Pope. And here we find a subtle callback. Remember the reference in the letter from Western Brittany, the one hinting at night sails and Iberian custody. That letter, too, refers obliquely to northern kin with cause. Kin, not allies. As if some within the Templar ranks already had blood ties or old oaths with the clans of Scotland. That idea opens doors to deeper conspiracies, like the claim that Templar families intermarried with Scottish nobles to preserve lines of power. It may sound like fiction, but for those carrying forbidden knowledge, the family tree may have been as strategic as the sword. There's one final detail worth mentioning. In 1312, the Pope formally dissolved the order. Most of their assets were to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but not in Scotland. There, the official property transfers never occurred. In fact, several former Templar lands remained in strange legal limbo, neither claimed nor confiscated. Some were quietly managed by monastic proxies. Others simply remained, untouched. A shadow left in the landscape, a whisper held in stone. You step now through a Highland glen wind keening against stone fences no longer claimed. Behind you the sea is far, but the memory of sails still lingers. And ahead, a trail curves upward into mist, and maybe, just maybe, into history waiting to be found. The sea narrows as you pass into the Hebridean waters, where the Atlantic breathes slower and the world feels older. Low clouds curl around hills like sleeping giants, and the jagged coastlines of the Isle of Mull rise in silhouette black stone against a gray horizon. There are no processions here, no heraldry, only wind and rock and the rhythm of waves that have whispered the same names for centuries. And among them, one name keeps returning: the Templars. Not in official histories, of course, but in whispers, on maps annotated in fading ink, in carved lintels and sunken ruins where tourists rarely tread. The Isle of Mull doesn't shout its secrets, it lets them grow moss. If the Templar fleet truly scattered after La Rochelle, as the evidence suggests, Scotland's Western Isles offered both remoteness and access out of reach, yet not unreachable. Mull, in particular, stood apart. Tucked between major sea lanes but ringed by cliffs, caves, and sheltered coves, it was a natural hideout for ships avoiding detection. And in 1307 it was under the control of Gaelic clans who owed no loyalty to Edward of England or to Papal Rome. That's not just convenient, that's strategic. You're not the first to notice. For decades, researchers have puzzled over local anomalies. Stone remnants of what appear to be non-Gaelic structures, arched foundations and worn columns with no match in regional architecture, dot the inland forests. One ruin in particular, known locally as the Burnt Chapel, contains a series of chisel marks that resemble stylized Templar crosses arranged not vertically, but in a strange horizontal arc. Archaeologists once dismissed these as later additions, but a controversial survey in the 1980s revealed the mortar binding the stones contained crushed shell and a lime composition strikingly similar to that used in Templar commanderies across France. It's not proof, but it is peculiar. And then there's the journal, an obscure document known only through fragments and references, the so-called Codex Macrae. Said to have been copied by a monk in the 15th century from an earlier Gaelic text, the Codex contains what reads like an oral account of strange foreign ships landing on Mull around the time of the Bruce Rebellion. The men aboard the text claims bore no clan tartans, but carried weapons stamped with a red seal like fire. They spoke little. They brought boxes too heavy for one man to lift, and they asked only for food privacy and stone in the hills. What does that mean, stone in the hills? Some believe it's a poetic reference to burial sites. Others think it hints at construction, perhaps a vault or a chamber. But the most persistent theory is also the most dramatic, that something was hidden. Something that required more than secrecy. It required the kind of permanence only stone can offer. Here we enter the realm of the controversial interpretation, the notion that Mull was not just a place of refuge, but a depot, a repository, a final lockbox for relics, documents, or knowledge too dangerous to carry further. This idea gained traction after the 1930s discovery of a cave system on the island's southern coast, long sealed by a rockslide. Inside were decayed wooden chests, badly rotted, but bearing fragments of metal and glass that didn't match local craftsmanship. The find was never formally catalogued. Some say the artifacts were quietly removed. Others claim the cave has since been resealed by the government, but in local pubs and among amateur historians, it became known simply as the chapel below. Skeptics roll their eyes. They argue that the Hebrides were far too isolated to serve any meaningful purpose to a fleeing Templar force. But that isolation is precisely the point. In a world where kings were combing abbeys and torching documents, obscurity was survival. Consider this: the fleet that left La Rochelle may have split deliberately. One group to the Iberian coast, another toward Ireland. A smaller specialized detachment, perhaps carrying the most valuable or most sacred items, might have sailed north, seeking a place not only to vanish, but to preserve. Mull, with its blend of remoteness and defensibility, fits the need. There's also a tantalizing callback to the Scottish refuge we explored earlier. A coastal ledger from a church near Oban records the unexpected arrival of goods from the west in 1310 barrels crates and 2 stone tablets written in Latin and code. That record is brief, unembellished, and buried among entries about dried fish and sheep tithes. But it's there, and it is the only known reference to foreign stone tablets arriving via sea in western Scotland during that period. You may wonder, of course, why no one has produced these artifacts. Why no great archaeological excavation has unearthed a chest marked with the Templar cross, sealed in wax bearing a chalice or a golden head. Perhaps it's because such treasures don't look the way we imagine. Perhaps they've crumbled. Or perhaps they were never intended to be found, only protected. That leads us to an open question still debated among scholars and seekers. If the fleet came to Mull, was it meant as a waypoint or an ending? Some say the Templars built nothing, that they handed over their cargo to local allies, then disappeared again into the Atlantic. Others insist the remains of a northern commandery lie buried beneath a field now used for sheep grazing, covered in stone and memory. Still others believe the fleet never landed here at all, that the stories of strange ships and southern weapons are local attempts to attach mystery to myth, a way of turning ruin into legend. But then you recall the voice of the travel journal mentioned before, the monk who offered bread to cloaked men with foreign coins. You remember the quiet voices in Brittany, the coded letters, the burnt names in papal scrolls. And here in this quiet inlet on Mull's southern coast, it all begins to echo. You stand at the mouth of the cave, real or imagined, where wind howls like a voice too long buried. You feel the stone under your palm, cool, damp, waiting. And you realize the fleet may not have simply escaped. It may have anchored itself into the bones of this place. The wind shifts again. Southward now. Warmer, drier, saltier in a different way. You leave behind the slate skies of the Hebrides and descend toward sunlit stone, toward the brackish Atlantic waters off the coast of Portugal. The air here smells not just of salt and fish, but of age-old defiance of an Iberian kingdom that uniquely among its peers refused to condemn the Knights Templar. When the papal decree arrived in Lisbon, heavy with excommunication and arrest orders, the Portuguese crown blinked and then stalled. King Dinis, the farmer king as he was known, did not burn or imprison the Templars. He didn't dissolve them, not really. Instead, he renamed them. The Order of Christ would eventually emerge as a spiritual successor, officially unlinked from the disgraced Templars, but suspiciously identical in structure, membership, and yes, naval capacity. But that's a tale for another night. For now, we linger in this space between when the ships still might have borne the Red Cross and the name of the temple still stirred unease. There's a well-established historical truth here, Portugal, unlike most of Catholic Europe, did not actively participate in the Templar suppression. While the French king hunted the order with zeal, King Dinis delayed, negotiated, and eventually restructured. And during that crucial window between 1307 and 1312, Portugal became a quiet haven. Which leads to a pressing question: did any part of the fleeing fleet make landfall here? Templar properties in Portugal had long been robust. Fortresses like Tomar and Pombal served as both military outposts and regional administrative centers. Coastal holdings near Setúbal and Lagos were particularly well suited to receive incoming ships, especially those seeking discretion. These ports were small, efficient, and closely tied to monastic authorities, who answered more readily to the crown than to the pope. One obscure detail from the Tomar archives stands out. A ledger from 1308 mentions the unexpected arrival of 3 ships carrying foreign timber cloth of strange dye and barrels not counted in previous records. The ships are not named. The crews are unlisted, but the phrasing is curious goods received from the Brotherhood beyond the wind. Beyond the wind. It's a poetic euphemism, possibly nautical slang, or perhaps a veiled reference to something that came not just from across the sea, but from outside the reach of Rome. Skeptics argue it was just a trade misentry, or a metaphor, but it coincides with a sudden uptick in construction around the Tomar fortress, new masonry work. New wells dug, tunnels reinforced. Again, nothing proves a Templar connection. But the timing feels more than circumstantial. There's also the matter of the salt ledger in Tavira. In 1309, the port records note a minor but strange adjustment in taxation. Several inbound vessels were granted waivers, usually reserved for royal transports or papal cargo. The entries are sparse, but an annotation beside one reads by order of the Quiet Seal. No known Portuguese bureaucracy operated under such a name. Historians have speculated it was an internal designation used for sensitive or confidential shipments. Some link it to the early precursor structures that later formed the Order of Christ. Others more boldly suggest it was a Templar code name, and this is where things move from logistical to symbolic. Portugal was not just a place of refuge. It was a kingdom poised on the edge of something new. The Reconquista was still ongoing, but the horizon had begun to shift. Mariners stared westward. Cartographers whispered of islands, and the Templars, ever fascinated with boundaries, with knowledge, with motion, might have sensed what Portugal represented, not a hiding place, but a starting line. This leads to the controversial interpretation that some of the fleet didn't flee to Portugal to disappear. They came to prepare. It sounds romantic, but consider the evidence. Within a few decades, Portugal becomes the cradle of European exploration. Henry the Navigator often linked to the Order of Christ funds expeditions that echo routes once rumored to have been charted by the Templars. Portuguese ships sail farther faster with uncanny confidence in winds and currents that had baffled their contemporaries. Their maps are better. Their guesses bolder. Did they inherit more than just ships? We recall from earlier the hints of Templar exposure to advanced navigation, perhaps through Arabic sources in the Levant. Star charts, astrolabes, knowledge carried not in treasure chests, but in the minds of scribes and helmsmen. If that knowledge needed safe harbor, Portugal was the logical destination. There's even a callback to the night sails under prearranged light mentioned in the Brittany letter. One curious detail often overlooked: the phrase was also found in a marginal note in a Portuguese devotional text from 1311. The same phrase, same wording, different language. Could it have been a password, a code passed across shores? Open scholarly debate rages around this possibility. Some claim it's coincidental, that we read too much into shared poetic turns. But others argue for continuity, that Portugal didn't simply adopt remnants of the Templar order, but absorbed it intact. If so, the fleet's disappearance wasn't a retreat. It was a transformation. You stand now in the shadow of Tamar Castle. The sun is high. Olive trees rustle in the wind. Children play near stone walls older than their surnames. But beneath your feet are catacombs. And in those catacombs, sealed vaults. Archives. Perhaps nothing more than bones and old wine. Or perhaps a flag. A carved map. A compass drawn by a hand that once gripped a Templar helm. Here the past doesn't feel buried. It feels veiled. And the fleet. It may not have vanished at all. It may have changed its colors. The banners hang differently now. The cross remains, but its shape softens, less martial, more rounded, echoing both continuity and camouflage. The year is 1319. You're standing beneath the high walls of Tamar once more, but this time not as a witness to flight or secrecy. Now you watch as something altogether subtler unfolds. The Knights Templar are gone. Officially. Executed, dissolved, defamed. But here in Portugal, they are also very much alive, reborn beneath a new name with old hands at the helm. The Order of Christ. It's one of the few historical facts acknowledged on all sides. King Dinis I of Portugal, facing papal pressure to disband the Templars, entirely found a legal workaround. He proposed the creation of a new order. Its purpose, religious, of course, protecting the faith, defending the kingdom. Its structure modeled on monastic ideals. Its members curiously similar to those who had once served in white robes trimmed in red. The Pope agreed, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps pragmatically. After all, the Iberian Peninsula was still engaged in the slow-burning conflict of the Reconquista, and the Church needed knights, even if they wore slightly different robes. In 1319, Pope John XXIII issued the papal bull Ad Ea Ex Quibus, formally authorizing the Order of Christ and transferring many of the Templar properties in Portugal into its custody. That transfer wasn't just a reshuffling of paperwork. It was a calculated resurrection. The newly created order inherited not only lands and castles, but commanderies, coinage systems, and most tellingly, ships. Portugal had always been a maritime culture, but the infusion of Templar naval assets gave it a quiet, sudden boost. Fleets once marked for seizure were quietly registered under a different name. Crews once labeled heretics were absolved and reassigned. Yet one cannot simply change uniforms and erase memory. Within the first generation of the Order of Christ, whispers persisted. That these were the same men. That rituals had merely been reworded, not rewritten. That symbols still lingered in the shadows, crosses etched onto keel beams. Stars carved beneath altar cloths, compass roses that pointed not to Jerusalem, but to somewhere west of the known world. An obscure but fascinating example emerges from a chapel near Lamego, where faded frescoes show robed men gathered around a table. Their tunics bear no overt sigils, but a closer look reveals ghosted outlines of Templar iconography beneath the surface paint, buried like memory beneath plaster. One figure points to a scroll, while another gestures toward a stylized horizon. Above them is an inscription barely legible, now veritas in tenebrous, truth in darkness. Coincidence, a devotional scene perhaps, or perhaps an artist's quiet acknowledgement of what everyone already knew, that the Templars were not gone, only veiled. This leads us to a contested but deeply intriguing document discovered in the Coimbra archives in the late 19th century. A letter unsigned, dated 1324. It refers to our brethren in disguise and the fleet preserved under holy silence. The Latin is elegant but clipped, suggesting a cleric. The letter mentions Tomar and those who steer not by the cross alone, but by the memory of the ark. Some interpret this as metaphor. Others believe it alludes to actual Templar ships operating under false flags, still navigating the coastlines of Europe under the protection of their Portuguese rebirth. Critics dismiss such claims, noting that the Order of Christ quickly became a conventional arm of the monarchy, that its members were nobles, bureaucrats, eventually even explorers. But that's precisely the point. Power doesn't always announce itself with swords. Sometimes it becomes administrative, strategic, naval. Within a few decades, Order of Christ ships were leading expeditions. They mapped islands, founded colonies, and pushed steadily into uncharted seas. And behind many of these voyages stood men whose fathers or grandfathers had worn Templar insignia. Their names changed, their flags changed, but the discipline, the secrecy, the appetite for the horizon that remained. Here's where the callback emerges. Remember the anonymous crates from the docks of La Rochelle, the ones marked with cryptic sigils said to have been loaded under moonlight before the arrests. There's a theory, controversial of course, that some of those crates survived. Not in Scotland, not buried in Mull, but carried aboard ships that made landfall on the Iberian coast and were quietly transferred to safe custody in Portugal. Their contents unknown, their purpose forgotten or deliberately obscured. Which raises the open question: what exactly was the Order of Christ preserving? Was it merely the continuation of Templar property and personnel, or did something more fundamental pass from one order to the next? Knowledge perhaps, or charts or archives, too dangerous to let perish in fire. This debate endures not just among scholars, but in the stones of Tamar itself. In the convent's chapter house, a mosaic compass points north-southeast and toward a symbol, a stylized ship beneath a cross. Not a Christian cross, but the specific flared cross used by the Templars, its arms widened at the tips, like a signpost cut by wind. It is not referenced in any religious text. No plaque explains it, but there it is embedded in the floor, as if charting a path no longer mapped. And what of the men who walked across it? One record from 1328 mentions a ship departing from Lagos under the banner of the Order of Christ, carrying sealed cargo for the West. No destination listed, no manifest filed, only a note in the margins, Servitium Antiquum, the ancient service. Was it missionary work or something else? You picture the ship now. Not sleek like a caravel, but wide and sturdy, built for ocean travel. Its sails are patched, its hull scuffed, but its crew is practiced. And as the sun drops behind the waves, the ship turns not toward the Mediterranean, but into the Atlantic, into dusk. Portugal gave the Templars more than shelter. It gave them a new name and a new direction. You stand now on a shoreline where the world once ended. The waves before you roll westward, endless and indifferent, carrying only the light of stars and the tug of unseen currents. In the early 14th century, this horizon was more than just a limit. It was a boundary between what was known and what was only guessed at. And it's here at this trembling edge that the most daring theory about the missing Templar fleet takes shape. What if they didn't hide? What if they left? It begins, as all legends do, with a single quiet possibility that some of the fleet, under cover of night and chased by betrayal, turned their bows not toward nearby sanctuary, but toward the open Atlantic. They weren't running. They were sailing, away from papal reach, away from burning scripts and bitter kings, toward something they believed was already waiting for them. It sounds implausible, absurd even. How could 14th century sailors cross an ocean centuries before Columbus? But pause, feel the wind on your face. Listen to what we know. There is one well-established historical fact often overlooked in this debate. Pre-Columbian transoceanic contact wasn't just theory, it had precedent. The Norse had already reached North America by the late 10th century. Their settlements at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland are archaeological certainties, not speculation. European ships had at least once crossed the Atlantic and returned, if not in great number, then at least in possibility. Now consider the Templars. They weren't mere soldiers. They were logisticians, cartographers, and unlike Viking raiders who coasted by dead reckoning and starlight alone, the Templars had access to emerging Arabic navigational tools, astrolabes, quadrant variations, and perhaps even early magnetic compasses passed through Moorish sources. They had studied with Eastern scholars. They'd recorded winds, tracked tides. They'd watched the heavens from desert monasteries and sea towers. They weren't guessing. So when the fleet disappeared from La Rochelle with fully stocked hulls and crews disciplined in secrecy, perhaps they weren't hiding from history. Perhaps they were aiming for it. There are stories, obscure, uneven, but persistent, of landfalls in the West. In the Azores, old stones etched with crosses no one could date. In Madeira, sailors spoke of ancient ruins already present when they arrived. On the Cape Verde Islands, there were rumors of white-skinned men who came from the East long before the age of discovery. Most historians brush these off. Colonial misinterpretation. Folklore. But they echo something larger. A sense that someone had been here before. One of the most tantalizing clues comes from a 15th-century Portuguese chronicle describing an island called Antillia, the island of the seven cities, discovered and then lost again, supposedly settled by bishops fleeing the Moors. Antillia appeared on several maps before vanishing into legend. But in one early version of the tale, the voyagers who reached it are said to have followed a red cross in the stars, a phrase so metaphorically rich it defies easy dismissal. Did the chronicler mean a constellation? Or was it a reference to sails? The controversial interpretation here is that Antillia was more than myth, that it preserved in veiled allegory a memory of Templar ships crossing the ocean and founding a hidden outpost, perhaps not in the Americas as we now define them, but somewhere between. An island, a refuge, a halfway world. Even stranger is a line found in a 14th-century English monastic diary buried in the Bodleian Library. The monk recording news from sailors returning from Iberia writes of French knights cast far west who sing mass by a broken sun. The phrase "broken sun" has perplexed translators. Some suggest it refers to clouded skies, others to a solar eclipse. But the mention of mass, and specifically French knights, raises eyebrows. There were no sanctioned French religious missions sailing west in 1308. Who then were they? Skeptics insist these are misreadings, coincidence, mistranslations compounded over centuries, and perhaps they're right. But then there's the callback to Portugal, the Order of Christ. Within a century of its founding, its ships were reaching the Azores, charting West African currents, and recording wind patterns suspiciously efficient for first attempts. These sailors moved with the precision of men following old instructions. Open debate continues among maritime historians. Did the Portuguese benefit from suppressed Templar charts? Did knowledge carried on those vanished ships? Knowledge of distant shores, cyclical tides, and elusive stars feed into the exploration explosion that followed. One peculiar detail lies in the construction of certain Portuguese ships from the early 15th century. The dimensions of their hulls, broad-beamed and deep-keeled, match descriptions of earlier Templar cargo ships more than contemporary Mediterranean designs. These vessels were built not for coastal hopping, but for distance, for survival, for the open, restless sea. And always the question returns, if the Templars were hiding, why risk the Atlantic unless they weren't hiding? Unless they were fulfilling? Some believe the fleet carried more than relics. that it carried prophecy, that among the ancient scrolls and whispered doctrines lay knowledge older than Christendom itself. Not blasphemy, just perspective, maps of a world wider than popes would allow, records of contact, of trade, of travel long forgotten. And if that's true, then sailing west wasn't madness. It was obedience. Not to Rome, to something deeper. You stand now on a Portuguese cliffside watching the sun fall into ocean's mouth. Below, the ruins of a watchtower crumble into dusk. You can almost see the ships again, red crosses fading in the dying light hulls, heavy with silence. No port calls, no letters. Just sails and stars and purpose, and the sea ever willing to keep its secrets. The wind smells different on this side of the world. The trees grow broader, older, unfamiliar. The stars overhead shift their patterns, and the North Star, once a constant guide for those European mariners, dips lower into the horizon. You're no longer on the shores of Portugal or the hidden coves of Scotland. Now you stand at the edge of the possible, among the first breath of the New World, before it was even called that. And the question hangs heavy and implausible: did the Templars make it here? It's a question no textbook will answer with confidence, yet one that refuses to die. Most scholars would say no. They'll point to Columbus and Cabot, to sanctioned voyages and royal charters. They'll tell you that nothing precedes the Spanish arrival in 1492 that counts as contact. But history isn't always what's written. Sometimes it's what's hinted at, what slips sideways through folklore and ruin, what rests buried beneath polite consensus. And so we ask again, could the Templars vanished from La Rochelle, scattered from Portugal, reborn under secret sails, have reached the Americas? Start with the oddities. Among the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia, there are oral traditions passed down for centuries that speak of pale-skinned men arriving in ships long before other Europeans. These visitors, according to some tellings, came not as conquerors, but as guests. They traded, shared knowledge, then vanished inland or back across the waves. No concrete artifacts tie these tales to the Templars, but some fragments do raise eyebrows. On the west coast of Newfoundland, a stone slab bearing a deeply worn cross was found in the 1800s, long dismissed as a hoax. But the cross is not Viking, nor is it Spanish. Its shape unmistakably resembles the splayed-armed Templar design. Erosion and time have rendered dating difficult, but the symbol's proportions match examples found at Templar sites in Portugal and southern France. Then there's the Kensington runestone. Discovered in Minnesota in the 19th century and long derided as a fraud, this inscribed stone tells of a group of Norse explorers who reached the interior of North America in 1362. Its language blends Old Swedish with later dialectal shifts that puzzled early experts. But among the strange symbols on the stone are repeated carvings that, according to some fringe researchers, echo iconography found on Templar manuscripts. The scholarly community remains divided. Most dismiss the Kensington runestone entirely. Others point to the curious blend of Nordic and Christian motifs as a possible indicator of joint expeditions, perhaps even under secret orders. Because what if the fleet didn't sail alone? There's an obscure but tantalizing theory that the Templars, desperate and dispossessed, sought out allies among the seafarers who had already touched these shores, the Norse descendants of Vinland. Intermarried communities in Greenland, weather-beaten coastal enclaves, men who knew the winds, knew the ice, and perhaps knew the way. That theory brings us to the Newport Tower. Standing in Rhode Island, this round stone structure has sparked debate for generations. Mainstream historians classify it as a 17th-century windmill, likely built by early colonial settlers. But others argue the design is older and deeply Templar. Its circular shape, the alignment of its windows to solstice points, and the peculiar keystones used in its arches suggest European medieval influence. Some of its architectural elements mirror the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a structure closely studied by the original Templars. Could the tower have been built by Templar descendants who settled or explored the region? Of course, speculation is not proof. But then again, history has often been built on far less. Let's revisit a known detail. The fleet's disappearance coincides with a vast void in documentation, not just in France, but across Europe. From 1307 to 1314, there's a conspicuous silence in maritime reports, particularly along the Atlantic-facing regions of Spain and Portugal. This isn't just about one country's records. It's a pan-European blackout concerning Templar sea movements. If some of those ships left the continent entirely bound not for hiding, but for reinvention, it would explain that silence. They didn't vanish. They crossed over. And perhaps they returned. A Spanish map from 1345 long, kept in a private collection, and rarely displayed, features an unlabeled landmass west of the Azores, larger than an island, smaller than a continent. The coastline is detailed with harbors marked in careful ink. The name Terra Nova appears in the margin not as a title but as a note, the new land. Its existence predates Columbus by nearly 150 years. Even more curious is a set of merchant logs from Bristol dated 1470 that mention occasional ships from the west. No names, no flags. Just a line of ink noting that these ships spoke little and bartered in precious salt. Some theorists believe these were Basque fishermen returning from Grand Banks waters, but others hold out the possibility, however slim, that these were remnants of a tradition older still. A seaborne secret passed from father to son, from Templar to sailor to trader. And what of the symbols in the American Southwest, in canyons and caves, known only to tribal elders? Petroglyphs exist that some believe mirror Mediterranean iconography. One in particular, a carved cross within a circle hidden deep in the deserts of Arizona, has been compared to the Templar cross in glory motif. Mainstream archaeologists warn against such leaps. Cultures often arrive at similar symbols independently, but the location far from coastal contact raises uncomfortable questions. The open scholarly debate endures. If Europeans arrived in the Americas prior to Columbus, where is the irrefutable evidence? The answer may be simple. They didn't come to conquer. They came to hide. Not in force, but in fragments. A handful of ships, a dozen men. Carving stone, planting vineyards, building chapels that would be swallowed by earth and time. No banners, no manifest destiny, just silence, survival. And so you walk now along a wooded trail in Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, or perhaps even further south. The birds here sing in unfamiliar cadences. The wind carries pine, not olive, and yet somewhere in the underbrush you catch the glint of carved stone. A half-erased cross, a symbol once chased by kings. And you wonder not just if they came, but if they ever left. Now you unroll the parchment. The edges are cracked with age, curled like dried petals, the ink browned but legible. You trace the contours of lands that don't yet exist, or rather shouldn't exist. There, to the left of the Pillars of Hercules, is something impossible. A suggestion of coastline where no coastline should be. Not an island, but a curve. A bulge of earth that defies the limits of the 14th century imagination. You stare at it. And once again, the question rises like mist from the sea. Did the Templars know? This is the heart of the Atlantic theory's darker twin, the map mystery. Because a ship needs more than hope to sail west. It needs direction. It needs wind. It needs math. And most of all, it needs a destination. What if they had one? There is one historical certainty here: the Templars, during their presence in the Holy Land, had access to Arab cartography and scientific instruments far ahead of contemporary European standards. While Christendom still clung to symbolic mappa mundi, circular theological diagrams that placed Jerusalem at the center and blurred the edges into myth, Arab scholars had been charting coastlines with mathematical precision. From the 9th century onward, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad produced astrolabes, star charts, and detailed atlases. The Templars, unlike most Western warriors, stayed long enough in the East to learn from them. Some believe they took those lessons home. One obscure manuscript, referred to only as the Chart of Shadows, surfaced briefly in the mid-1500s in a private library in Bruges. It was said to depict not only Western Europe and North Africa, but also a landmass to the far west, labeled Terra Nova Incognita. It vanished shortly after its discovery, either stolen, hidden, or destroyed. But a Jesuit scholar who transcribed fragments described Templar-style annotations throughout the chart, including the phrase Mare Silentium, Sea of Silence, inscribed over the Atlantic. More strikingly, he noted coordinates that roughly correspond to the eastern seaboard of North America. If genuine, the chart predates Columbus by nearly 2 centuries. Skeptics, as always, scoff. The manuscript was never verified. The Jesuit was a mystic. But his notes align with another strange artifact, the Vinland map. Unearthed in the 20th century and still hotly contested, the Vinland map shows part of North America labeled as Vinland, supposedly drawn in the mid-15th century. Though its authenticity is debated, chemical tests suggest the ink may be older than once thought. More intriguing still, the map includes notations using Latin shorthand common in 13th century Templar documents. Some scholars believe this is coincidence. Others whisper that it's not a forgery at all. It's a copy of something much older. A callback surfaces here from Section 12. Remember the 1345 Portuguese map with its unlabeled landmass west of the Azores? That same coastal arc appears in 3 other pre-Columbian documents, including the mysterious Pizzigani chart of 1367. Each depiction varies slightly, but all suggest a vague awareness of Western lands long before official discovery. So how did they know? The controversial interpretation is simple in theory, but radical in implication. The Templars may have possessed charts that showed lands beyond Europe, not because they discovered them, but because someone else had long before and shared that knowledge. Consider this: the Templars had close connections with Moorish scholars in the Iberian Peninsula. Córdoba, under Islamic rule, was a haven of astronomy and navigation. If even fragments of ancient Phoenician or Carthaginian sea lore survived into Moorish hands, and from there to Templar scrolls, it's conceivable that whispers of Western shores trickled into their archives. A tantalizing clue lies in a Templar codex discovered in Tomar in the 1800s, buried beneath the chapel floor. In one section, the text refers to lands beyond the veil where stars bend lower and time unwinds. It reads like poetry, but the phrasing is curious. Not mythic. Observational. The stars bend lower. That's a detail you notice when watching the night sky shift with latitude. There is also an open scholarly debate regarding compass development. Though the magnetic compass was formally adopted in Europe in the 14th century, some argue that the Templars experimented with lodestones and directional tools much earlier. Combined with stellar navigation passed down from the east, it could have allowed for long-distance sea travel with more confidence than assumed. Still, knowledge is one thing. Willingness is another. Why would they sail west if they weren't sure? Here's where belief enters the story. Some Templars were rumored to have embraced esoteric doctrines mixing Christian mysticism with Hermetic thought and fragments of pre-Christian lore. The concept of terra sancta, a new holy land, was not foreign to them. Could a prophecy or vision have compelled a faction of the fleet to seek it, not conquest, but preparation, preservation? One final detail ties the narrative tighter: a 14th-century Catalan atlas crafted by Jewish cartographers working under the crown of Aragon shows a series of compass roses pointing not toward Jerusalem, but out into the Atlantic. One of them is marked with a symbol, not a star, not a cross, but a double spiral echoing Celtic and Templar motifs alike. Was it a clue? Or was it simply cartographic flair? You stand now before the great Atlantic again, but this time with a map in your hand. Not GPS, not coordinates. Just faint lines, impossible arcs, and a single red cross near the edge of the page. You feel the pull, not of gravity, but of mystery. And you begin to understand. The Templar fleet may not have been running from something. It may have been navigating toward something it had always known was there. A land half remembered, a world half drawn, and perhaps a secret meant not to be conquered, but to be kept. It always comes down to treasure, doesn't it? Not in the glittering Hollywood sense, no cursed chests or booby-trapped tombs, but in the quieter, weightier sense. Gold, silver, documents, relics, secrets of state and soul. When the Templars vanished, it wasn't just their fleet that went missing. It was what may have been inside those ships. And that more than anything else is what has kept tongues wagging and theories spiraling for over 7 centuries. We begin with a grounded truth: the Knights Templar were wealthy, monumentally so. Their coffers were filled not by plunder, but by gift and trust. Monarchs deposited fortunes with them. Pilgrims paid for protection. Entire villages owed tithes. Their assets weren't just in coin, but in land, livestock, timber, grain. They functioned essentially as the first international banking network. When a nobleman died in the Holy Land, his belongings often went to the temple. When a king sought a loan, it was the Templars who financed him. It's a well-established historical fact that by 1307 their wealth rivaled that of many kingdoms, and Philip IV of France knew it. That's one reason, perhaps the chief reason, for the arrests. The king was bankrupt, his war chest depleted, his debts to the Templars substantial. Destroying the order erased those debts, but confiscating their treasure that proved trickier. When Philip's men raided Templar commanderies in Paris and beyond, they found records, ledgers, scribes, but little actual gold. Vaults were empty, storerooms abandoned, chests locked, but light. Where had it all gone? The most enduring theory is that the treasure was moved in advance, spirited away aboard the fleet before the king's noose tightened. The silence of La Rochelle's port records the early provisioning of ships, and the vague confessions under torture all point toward a hasty but coordinated evacuation. But here's where the theory branches. Some believe the fleet's entire purpose was to secure that treasure. Not men, not maps, just gold relics and secrets. A mobile vault designed not to fight, but to vanish, quietly, irretrievably. A peculiar passage in a late 14th century chronicle from Lyon describes oxen pulling sledges southward through the night under the guise of funeral procession, with wagons containing unopened chests sealed with cord and wax. The implication that before the ships even sailed, Templar riches were moved to coastal loading points in secrecy. Funeral processions were rarely stopped. Few would question a priest leading a caravan by torchlight, especially not in plague-weary times. An obscure but compelling anecdote survives from an English knight, Sir Hugh de Haversham, who wrote to a relative in York in 1311 claiming to have heard of Templar wealth cast into caves of the Atlantic-bound cliffs. The wording suggests a hidden coastal cache, possibly never meant to be recovered, just kept out of reach. And here enters one of the more controversial interpretations, that the Templar treasure wasn't solely material, that it included scrolls, writings, artifacts whose value wasn't monetary but theological or political, secrets capable of damaging the church, or at least its reputation. Among the accusations made during the Templar trials were repeated references to strange rituals, odd oaths, and worship of a mysterious head. Most historians see these as fabricated charges induced under duress, but others believe there may have been something symbolic at the core, an object or text representing unorthodox knowledge. Not heretical necessarily, but dangerous to the dogma of the time. If the Templars held such items, the pressure to hide them would have been immense. Recall from earlier the crates marked with serpents or loaded under moonlight, and the phrase from the Brittany letter cargo of uncertain value. That phrase appears again, interestingly, in a 14th century Portuguese port log at Lagos. The same wording. Not a coincidence, perhaps, but a code. A shorthand between brethren. Something understood but never written outright. So where could the treasure have gone? Some suggest it was divided. A portion smuggled to Scotland as we explored in Mull. A portion carried to Portugal, hidden in the strongholds of what would become the Order of Christ. And a third portion, perhaps, the most precious, set adrift on ships bound west beyond the reach of any throne. That westward arm of the theory has inspired 1,000 books. Treasure hunters speak of Templar gold buried in Nova Scotia, or in the caves of the Azores, or in the swamps of southern America. Oak Island, in particular, has become a shrine to the theory, with shafts and traps said to guard treasure too sacred or too dangerous to recover. There, too, symbols attributed to the Templars have been found: crosses carved into stone bores, arranged in geometrical patterns, clues half erased by water and time. Open scholarly debate continues on whether these signs are genuine or the product of later fantasy. But the persistence of the symbols and their uncanny resemblance to known Templar marks remains hard to ignore. Even in France, at Gisors Castle, legend tells of a hidden vault beneath the hill where Templar gold was buried before the fleet sailed. Excavations in the 20th century revealed empty chambers, but nearby, carved deep into the wall, was a phrase in Latin: non omnis in terris, not all is on earth. A message. A red herring or a reminder. The callback here is subtle but pointed. In Section 7 we explored the erasure of records, the deliberate silencing of what should have been. Perhaps the treasure wasn't just hidden in caves or ship holds, but in absence itself, in places never written down, in silence practiced like an art. You kneel now on a rocky cliff, wind at your back, facing the endless blue. You press your hand to the earth and wonder not what glitter might lie beneath, but what truths were buried to keep the world safe, or ignorant, and you realize the treasure may never have been meant to be found, only to be kept from those who would misuse it. You walk now in shadow, not darkness but the soft hush of stained glass silence. The high vaults of a Gothic cathedral rise above you, ribs of stone holding up centuries. The air smells of candle wax and damp stone, of prayers soaked into limestone. But it's not the echoes of choirs or sermons that you're listening for. You're looking for something quieter, something carved into the margins, scratched into the wood of a pew, hidden in plain sight. Because if the Templar fleet vanished to protect something or some things, those who remained behind may have left breadcrumbs, Not bold declarations. Nothing so obvious. Just ciphers. One well-established fact easily overlooked is that many Templar churches and chapels across Europe were left untouched during the purges. While royal forces seized urban commanderies and visible assets, rural structures, especially isolated churches, were often ignored or forgotten. In these sanctuaries, stonecutters and masons continued their work, some perhaps still loyal to the fallen order. And it is in these structures that we begin to find symbols. The first layer is architectural. In certain Templar chapels, particularly in southern France and northern Spain, floor plans deviate subtly from the standard Latin cross. Instead, they mimic the octagonal pattern of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which the Templars had once controlled. This design wasn't just symbolic. It was precise, echoing sacred geometries with roots in older traditions. Every angle, every column seemed to whisper alignment, calculation, intent. But it's the smaller marks that matter more. In the port city of Alais-les-Bains, a crumbling chapel once used by the Templars contains a wall carving nearly worn away by time. At first glance, it's just a sunburst, but upon closer inspection, the raised number 33 matching not only the Masonic degrees that would emerge later, but also correlating with certain coded references found in Templar scrolls from the Levant. A reach, maybe, but similar motifs appear in multiple Templar sites, suggesting replication rather than coincidence. Then there are the ship carvings. In dozens of coastal churches from Brittany to Galicia, tiny ships are etched into the backs of pews, into choir stalls, even on the undersides of stone arches. Always the same shape, single-mast vessels with square sails and deeply curved keels, distinctive features of Templar cargo ships. These are not decorative. They are careful, deliberate. Each ship usually points west, never east, never inland. In one church near Finisterre, the westernmost tip of Spain, a series of ships are carved along the edge of the sanctuary. Follow them in sequence, and their angles match a progression of nautical headings, each adjusted by exactly 11 degrees. 11. The number appears again and again in Templar iconography, long speculated to represent duality, two ones, side by side, standing as silent sentinels. Of course, not everyone sees codes. Skeptics argue these are just artistic flourishes, idle etchings by bored masons. But then you find the inscriptions. There's an obscure Latin phrase scratched into the lintel of the small chapel at San Juan de Duero sicut navis, sub lunae lumine, like a ship beneath the moon's light. It appears above a doorway that opens westward. There's no record of the phrase in any known hymn or liturgy. And when mapped against the position of the moon during key maritime tides in 1307, it aligns imperfectly but compellingly. A controversial interpretation has grown in recent years that these carvings and phrases represent a coded map, not in the sense of a literal chart, but a symbolic relay breadcrumbs laid across Europe for those who would know what to look for. One carved symbol found repeatedly is a cross inside a circle. Not the familiar Celtic form, but a flattened circle as if seen from above like a seal or a compass. This motif appears in the Templar chapel in Metz, again in the cloister at Évora in Portugal, and again faintly on a sandstone step in a church in southwest Ireland. In each case, the placement is peculiar, not at eye level but low at shin height, as if meant to be seen only by those who walked, not those who ruled. There's also the curious case of the stained glass window in the Cathedral of Chartres, depicting a ship with an anchor wrapped in ivy. Ivy in medieval Christian symbolism represented memory and endurance. An anchor traditionally signified hope, but within the Templar context, some scholars believe the ivy-wrapped anchor symbolized waiting, a fleet hidden biding time rooted in secrecy. This leads us to the open scholarly debate where the Templars deliberately encoding a message through sacred art, or are modern interpreters simply projecting meaning into unrelated symbols. Traditionalists argue for coincidence, that churches were always full of ships and stars and sunbursts, images of salvation and divine journeying. But others point to the sheer recurrence, the specific design elements, the uncanny westward alignment, and the consistency of symbols across distant geographies. A callback now rises soft and steady from section 14. The double spiral on the Catalan compass, a motif mirrored in a floor mosaic at the Church of Santa Maria do Olival in Tamar. There, beneath the high altar, the spiral wraps around a cross, again not overt, not declared, but felt. There is also the key of silence, a term found in a single codex, attributed to a Templar chaplain in Aragon. In his notes, he mentions songs, not sung prayers, not voiced paths, not drawn but shaped by sign. That sounds like metaphor. Unless you believe, as some do, that the entire purpose of the carvings was to transmit information without speaking a word. This theory has grown legs among cryptographers. In 2007, a team of mathematicians analyzing spacing patterns between carvings in a French abbey discovered a numeric progression matching the Fibonacci sequence. Was it coincidence or embedded structure? Either way, the carvings continue. In quiet chapels, in half-ruined priory gardens, in abandoned ports where tides now claim the walkways. Each symbol etched like a breath, each message wrapped in centuries of dust. You walk now through one such church, its windows shattered, its pews devoured by lichen. A single beam of light reveals an engraving near the altar, a star, a line, a curved crescent. Meaningless, perhaps, or maybe a map of stars used by men fleeing west, a memory hidden in stone, and just maybe, a key to unlock the path the fleet once sailed. The torchlight flickers as you descend the stone steps deeper into the vaults of a once Templar commandery, now repurposed, refaced, rebranded. The crosses have changed. The robes are black instead of white. The rule of silence remains, but the language of prayer has shifted subtly. You've stepped into the headquarters of the Order of the Knights Hospitaller, and you can't help but wonder, did they inherit a legacy or steal a secret? When the Templars fell, the Hospitallers rose. It's a well-established historical fact that after Pope Clement V officially dissolved the Templars in 1312, a significant portion of their property was transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. In theory, this was a strategic realignment. The Church needed a loyal military order, one less tangled in finance, and far from the smoke of inquisitorial flames. The Hospitallers, who had long coexisted sometimes uneasily with the Templars, were the natural recipients. Lands, castles, manors, even livestock changed hands. But there was something conspicuously missing the fleet. Ships are harder to seize than land. They float, they move, they vanish. Most documents regarding the Templar fleet, those that survived, make no mention of them being absorbed by the Hospitallers. In fact, records of Hospitaller naval expansion in the immediate years following the Templar dissolution are curiously slim. It's only later in the mid-14th century that their naval power increases noticeably. And so the question emerges, did the Hospitallers take more than just land? Did they take the fleet quietly outside the scope of official transfer? Some historians suggest that former Templar captains simply switched orders, that they changed cloaks and continued their work under a new name. But others suggest something more clandestine. One obscure detail comes from a 1313 letter from a Genoese portmaster. He reports a convoy of ships docking at night under neutral colors, claiming Hospitaller allegiance, but lacking proper identification. The crews refused inspection. The ships were allowed to resupply and leave. Their logs listed sacred goods in transition, no further details. The portmaster's frustration is clear in his closing line. Their banners show the black cross, but their manner shows the red. Could this have been a portion of the Templar fleet masquerading under Hospitaller identity? The controversial interpretation is that the Hospitallers either knowingly sheltered fragments of the Templar fleet or intercepted them. Some accounts from Malta centuries later describe ancient ships arriving from unknown seas, bearing relics and charts, stored in the lower vaults of Hospitaller fortresses. These were not war trophies. They were stored, kept quiet, and in some cases lost to time. The idea of rivalry between the two orders adds a darker possibility that the Hospitallers didn't just inherit the Templars' assets, they usurped them. Evidence of friction between the two dates back to the Crusades. While both orders served in the Holy Land, their overlapping jurisdictions often sparked tensions. Disputes over territory influence and funding were frequent. Some accounts even describe physical confrontations between knights of the rival orders. So when the Templars fell and the Church turned to the Hospitallers, was it an act of favor or of convenience? A callback is due here from Section 7, where we examined the sudden silence in the records following the Templar arrests. What if that silence wasn't just absence but suppression? And who would benefit most from a missing fleet never resurfacing? Consider the possibility that a faction within the Hospitallers orchestrated a soft absorption, that certain Templar commanderies were folded into the Hospitaller network without full disclosure, that map scrolls and artifacts never made it to Rome, but instead were redirected, reinterpreted as Hospitaller history. One account from Cyprus in 1316 tells of a forgotten fortress newly reopened by Hospitaller hands. Inside, scribes recorded documents of unknown tongue and curved compass tools later sent inland for analysis. The description matches reports of Templar navigational gear. Yet no such items appear in the Hospitaller inventories filed with the Church. There is also the open scholarly debate over the sudden rise in Hospitaller exploration activity in the decades after the Templars' fall. By the 1350s, Hospitaller ships begin appearing in records far outside their former zones of influence in North Africa, the Western Mediterranean, and even near the Canary Islands. Their logs, what few survive, reference routes established by brethren before the flame. The flame, a term some believe refers to the Templar burnings in France. Was this an acknowledgement of inherited knowledge or a quiet confession? Further complicating the picture are secretive rituals that began to emerge within the Hospitaller order in the 15th century rituals, involving oaths of silence, coded prayers, and geometric symbolism absent from their earlier practices. One such rite involves a map marked not with geographic names, but with constellations. The ceremony is referred to cryptically as the reorientation. Whether this was a spiritual metaphor or an encoded voyage plan remains uncertain. And then there's the matter of Malta. When the Hospitallers took control of the island in 1530, they transformed it into a naval bastion. Deep vaults were carved beneath the city of Valletta, labyrinths of stone said to house relics from every corner of Christendom. In one vault, sealed until the 19th century, workers discovered sealed amphorae ship planks and a rusted anchor etched with a symbol not matching Hospitaller heraldry. It matched the Templar cross. The artifact now sits in a private collection, its provenance disputed. But its discovery reignited the theory that some ships, some relics, and some knowledge passed from one order to another, not in daylight, but in shadow. You stand now at the shoreline near Rhodes, where the Hospitaller fleet once stood guard against the Ottoman tide. The waves lap against ancient stones, and you wonder, did these same tides once carry vessels not marked by black crosses but by red? Did a handshake or a dagger decide their fate? And in that quiet, beneath the thunder of waves and vaults alike, a truth flickers like torchlight. The Templars may have been erased by kings, but their secrets may have been adopted by rivals. The lanterns bob gently on the water. You stand on the edge of a Venetian dock surrounded by quiet grandeur canals, like Vane's palaces gleaming with faded gold and gondolas sliding past with almost choreographed grace. But beneath the surface of this city's beauty lies something else. Commerce, intrigue, a centuries-old genius for discretion. And somewhere in the whisper of salt air and old coin, the faint trace of missing ships. Of all the powers in medieval Europe, Venice was uniquely positioned to know everything and say nothing. A historical certainty anchors us here. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Venice was one of the wealthiest maritime republics in the world. Its trade routes stretched from Constantinople to Alexandria to London. Its diplomats wove deals with popes and sultans alike. Its navy could rival kingdoms, but it preferred to win wars through ledgers and contracts, not battle. So when the Templar fleet vanished in 1307, the Serenissima may not have raised a public alarm. But it's hard to believe they weren't watching. It's documented that the Templars had an established presence in Venice. They owned warehouses, wharves, and private berths. Their ships moved in and out of the Venetian lagoon regularly, often under less scrutiny than foreign vessels due to long-standing arrangements with the Doge's council. Templar cargoes often bypassed regular tariffs, an arrangement quietly accepted in exchange for the order's reliable transport of goods and precious relics from the East. Yet after the arrests in France, those ships stop appearing in Venice's formal registers, not all at once. Not conspicuously, just gradually and completely. And here begins the shadow trail. A ledger fragment from 1308 discovered in a ledger chest once owned by the merchant Niccolò di Reggio lists 7 vessels newly acquired for use under Guild Standard Origin unlisted. This note appears beside several adjustments in dock space assignments and grain tariffs. What's odd is that no corresponding sales or purchases are recorded in that year. No noble or merchant had divested a fleet, and yet the ships were suddenly there. Were they Templar? It's the small inconsistencies that draw attention. The names of the vessels are either blank or unusually abbreviated. The captains are listed only by first name, and their routes are all westbound toward Iberia and North Africa, far outside normal Venetian commercial focus at the time. This leads us to the controversial interpretation: Venice didn't just observe the disappearance of the Templar fleet, it helped repurpose it. Venice had no reason to publicly ally with a condemned order, but pragmatism often trumped morality in the Republic. If a group of ships, well-built, crude, and untraceable, suddenly needed new identity and ownership, Venice had both the infrastructure and the motivation to absorb them quietly. Better to rebrand than to let those assets fall into the hands of rivals or worse, rot in disuse. One peculiar chronicle from the Abbey of San Zaccaria tells of a group of strange brethren who arrived by sea in early 1309. They bore letters of passage stamped with wax, but no seal the abbey recognized. The chronicler notes that their clothes were monastic but foreign, their speech clipped, their purpose unclear. They stayed 3 nights, then vanished. No names are given, but in the margins of the same chronicle, a later monk added a faint note: Templari, or what remained of them. Some believe this visit was a scouting mission, an attempt to negotiate safe harbor or vessel conversion with sympathetic merchants, or perhaps with the guilds, those powerful merchant families whose influence often rivaled the Doge's. A callback slips into view. Remember the sealed cargo for the West mentioned in Section 11. A similar phrase appears in a dock inventory from the Arsenal di Venezia in 1310, sealed crates from anonymous convoy to be stored until further instruction. Again, no sender, no destination. The crates were described only as heavy reinforced and bearing unfamiliar symbols. No indication of their fate survives. An open scholarly debate persists around whether Venice acted as a middleman, not harboring the fleet permanently, but laundering its identity. Consider how easily sails can be changed, crests repainted, crews reassigned. Venice, with its immense network of notaries, shipbuilders, and brokers, could transform a fleet's identity in weeks. A Templar cog could become a merchant bark with a Genoese-sounding name. Records could be corrected, origins rewritten, and perhaps they were. Supporting this is the unusual behavior of Venice's maritime courts in the decade after 1307. Several cases appear in the archives where ownership of ships was disputed, yet the ships themselves lacked prior documentation. One judge in a ruling from 1311 declared that the origin of one vessel could not be proven, but no evidence of illegality could be sustained. In other words, it came from nowhere, but no one could say how. Even more compelling is the architectural detail hiding in the church of San Giovanni e Paolo, where carved into the frame of a side altar is a stylized compass rose its center not pointing north but west. Beneath it, faint Latin ad mare redemptum, to the redeemed sea. It's not part of any known liturgical tradition. It appears only once there. Some see it as an homage to salvation, others as a map. And if Venice helped the fleet vanish, what did it gain? Ships, loyalty, secrets. It's plausible that some of the Templars' more controversial documents on relics, ritual, or finance passed into Venetian vaults. Perhaps that knowledge helped shape future dealings with the Church. Perhaps it fueled later ventures into cartography and colonial commerce. Venice rose quickly in the 14th and 15th centuries, cementing its place not just as a merchant republic, but a maritime intelligence power. Yet the most haunting evidence may not be in paper or stone, but in absence. In the Doge's logbooks, there's an entire section missing from spring 1308, torn not carefully. Ripped, a jagged edge of vellum remains. The previous and following pages are intact. Why was it removed? What was written there? You stand now in the shadows of Venetian colonnades, wind tugging at your cloak. Below your feet, the stones are slick with spray and centuries. You glance over your shoulder, no soldiers, no monks, no inquisitors. Just the gentle slap of water against mooring posts. And in the fog, a ship, faint, silent, sail trimmed in black. Or was it once Red Venice never needed to hide a fleet? It only needed to rename it. It begins with a sail. Not the red-crossed canvas of Templar legend, but something plainer, striped or solid, dyed in common colors, indistinguishable from a dozen other merchant vessels hugging the coasts of the Mediterranean. The hull bears no crest. The captain offers no lineage. There is nothing overtly holy or heroic here. Just a ship, anonymous. But look closely. The timbers are old, well kept. The lines are too clean. The rigging too efficient. The crew speaks little, works fast, and answers to no guild. You've seen this ship before, or one like it. Maybe in France, maybe in Portugal, maybe in the dark pages of a forgotten ledger. Welcome to the theory of maritime disguise. By 1310, just a few years after the Templar arrests, the Mediterranean is humming with anonymous vessels, ships that move like ghosts through waters long patrolled by kings and cardinals. Their papers are vague, their flags change with the wind, and their names always new, always forgettable. This isn't just conjecture. There is a well-established historical fact that during the early 14th century, the use of false flags and altered identities among ships surged, particularly among traders operating out of ports like Barcelona, Marseille, and Pisa. The rise of pirate threats, shifting royal allegiances, and economic instability made disguise a necessity. But for a vanished fleet seeking permanent concealment, it was salvation. There's one particularly striking record from 1312, filed in the maritime archives of Majorca. It describes a ship known as Santa Corvina, flagged under the crown of Aragon, which docked with a hold full of copper salt fish and sealed cargo of religious distinction. The manifest states that the vessel's origin was Genoa. But the same vessel appears a year later in a port register from Valencia, this time under the name Il Leone Nascosto, with an entirely different origin story claiming to be from Rhodes. 2 years later, it appears again, now called La Verita, arriving in Lisbon. Same keel length, same crew chief, different flags. Some maritime historians have dismissed these as clerical mistakes or common identity shifts by freelance traders. But others point to the consistency of route and the unusual consistency in crew behavior ships that never stayed more than 2 days. Crews who slept on board. No visits to local taverns. No guild interactions. Just in out gone. A callback to Venice is unavoidable here. Section 18's shadow trail of ships suddenly appearing in registers without explanation. If Venice, with its bureaucratic sophistication, could facilitate this kind of identity laundering, then the open seas became the ultimate haven. Once a ship left port under one flag, there was nothing to stop it from raising another. This leads to a controversial interpretation. The Templar fleet didn't just vanish, it blended. It was absorbed into the existing maritime economy, masquerading as coastal cargo haulers, grain runners, or minor warships for hire. But beneath the surface, they retained their discipline, their mission, perhaps even their sacred cargo. One obscure document from Pisa's maritime tribunal in 1315 references a dispute involving a foreign vessel refusing inspection on grounds of holy charter. The term was unusual, and the tribunal's record notes the argument as unfamiliar to maritime law. The ship in question paid an immediate fine and departed within hours. Its name, Sanctus Fidem. No other record of such a ship exists. The tribunal added one more note. The captain bore no banner, but the crew made sign of the cross in the Eastern manner. Not Catholic, not Orthodox. Something in between. Could these have been Templars in disguise? The debate continues. Some argue that the use of false flags was simply too dangerous, that medieval ports, though inconsistent, kept close watch on unsanctioned vessels. But others point to the vast web of informal maritime practices, the quiet agreements between portmasters and captains, the bribes, the nods. In the right place, with the right coin, you could dock under any name you liked. And here's where the theory deepens. The Templar ships may have not only changed flags, but also changed structure. Evidence exists of vessels being physically altered, masts, shortened decks, modified figureheads removed. One wreck discovered off the coast of Corsica, carbon dated to the early 14th century, features hull construction identical to Templar shipwright manuals recovered in Provence. But no record ties the ship to any known fleet. Its iron fittings bear a cross scratched so faintly into the keel that only under raking light can it be seen. The cross has arms widened at the ends, Templar style. More than that, certain Mediterranean dry docks show unexplained spikes in custom work between 1308 and 1312. Not new ships, but extensive retrofits. A shipwright in Palermo logged extensive alterations to unlisted vessels paid in foreign silver. He notes the crews spoke an unfamiliar Frankish dialect and bore no national crest. And then there's the graffiti. In Marseille, beneath the old Templar chapel, a storeroom was uncovered during renovation. Carved into the wall beneath layers of soot and damp is a line of ships barely knee-high. Each has a different flag, the Lion of Aragon, the Fleur-de-Lis, the Maltese Cross, even a half-sunburst. But each hull is identical. And next to them in Latin, the inscription Una forma multi voltus. One form, many faces. An open scholarly debate persists around the ethics of such concealment. If true, this wasn't just survival. It was deliberate infiltration, a silent reoccupation of the maritime world by men the church had branded traitors. But to whom were they loyal? To God, to an ideal, or to a secret too dangerous to die? The deeper you dive, the more the theory holds water. The timeline matches, the behavior aligns, and the silence again is consistent. No captured Templar ships, no recorded sea battles, just anonymous vessels carrying unknown cargo under flags that meant nothing and everything. You walk now along the breakwater of an old Catalan port. The rocks are warm beneath your feet. The sun dips low. A fishing boat passes, its flag faded, unrecognizable. You imagine a different time, a different vessel, same size, same silhouette. But aboard, parchment wrapped in oilcloth, a chest bolted shut. A man at the helm who says nothing but watches everything. They didn't just run, they reappeared. Everywhere and nowhere at all. The sails you see now are white, cut low to the water, sharp against the haze of early morning. But they do not bear the cross. Instead, they bear the griffin, the symbol of Genoa, the maritime republic, that in the early 14th century rivaled Venice not only in trade, but in secrecy, ambition, and the quiet art of selective loyalty. If the Templar fleet needed allies or betrayers, few cities offered both so richly as Genoa. Genoa was a paradox. It professed piety but traded with Muslims. It sponsored crusades, yet harbored pirates. Its galleys carried grain, silk, salt, and sometimes whispers. Where Venice negotiated with courts, Genoa dealt with individuals. Mercenaries, captains, princes on the run. And in 1307, the year the Templars vanished from the docks of La Rochelle, Genoa was watching, as it always did. The historical record is clear. The Templars had dealings in Genoa. They held properties, maintained accounts with Genoese bankers, and occasionally collaborated with Genoese shipping interests. A minor commandery existed near the Western Gate handling coastal logistics. But it was no stronghold. Genoa was not a Templar city. It was a city that could be bought. And that brings us to the theory that the Templar fleet may have passed through or been intercepted by Genoa during its escape. One well-established fact stands out. In late 1307, Genoese maritime records show an unusual spike in private ship leasing. Not for local trade, but for outbound voyages to unstated destinations. These records were signed off not by Doge officials, but by private notaries, an oddity in such a tightly controlled port. Even more curious is a record from the Bank of San Giorgio, Genoa's financial powerhouse. In early 1308, a new account was opened under the name Societas Fraterna Brotherhood Company. The account was seeded with silver marks and quickly used to purchase ship fittings, rope pitch, and long-term warehouse leases near the waterline. No company by that name had been recorded before, and 3 years later it was gone. All funds withdrawn. No successor entity. No court record of its dissolution. Was it a shell company affront? Some believe so. Especially when cross-referenced with an obscure note found in a letter from a hospitaller in Rhodes. The letter describes a fleet of unknown vessels passing through Genoa, sailing under colors not their own, yet welcomed with coin in hand. He speculates cautiously that these may have been remnants of the expelled, a likely reference to the Templars. This leads to a controversial interpretation that Genoa didn't just allow the fleet to pass, it brokered it. For a price. There is precedent. Genoese merchants had long served as intermediaries between Christian and Muslim states. They dealt in ransom diplomacy and intelligence. If the Templars arrived with relics, treasures, or crucial documents, Genoa would not have refused them. But it would have charged dearly. Which opens the darker branch of this theory, betrayal. What if Genoa took them in, then sold them out? A document in the Vatican's archives refers to a 1310 transaction between unnamed maritime agents and a foreign military party stripped of papal protection. The sum exchanged was significant. The description matches Templar profiles, the buyer not listed. But the implication is chilling. One letter from a Castilian admiral written in 1311 warns of sailors taken on at Genoa who bore old allegiances and advises extra measures of caution for those whose ships were formerly marked in red. This implies that some ships formerly of the Templar fleet may have been absorbed into other navies, sold off piecemeal, their origins scrubbed, and captains replaced. A callback emerges here quietly. In Section 19, we explored ships using false flags. Several vessels traced in that chapter bore structural elements unique to Templar shipwrights: wide hulls, elevated forecastles, strengthened keels. If Genoa acquired such vessels, it might explain how they resurfaced in altered form across the Mediterranean, and perhaps how they disappeared again. Open scholarly debate surrounds a letter discovered in 1903 written by a Genoese merchant named Bartolomeo Cini. The letter addressed to a client in Cyprus references a compact made between the Black Sails and the Silent Brothers. The phrasing is ambiguous, but Silent Brothers has been interpreted by some as a coded reference to former Templars, especially those operating under pseudonyms after the arrests. Cini also notes cryptically that the price for silence was not silver but direction. Direction, not payment, but a map. Could Genoa have accepted the Templars in exchange for navigational knowledge? Charts, secret sea lanes, it wouldn't be the last time. Later, Genoese expeditions benefited from remarkably accurate nautical data even in territories they hadn't officially explored. One 14th-century Genoese map depicts coastal features of the Canary Islands with uncanny precision features, confirmed only centuries later. Scholars have long debated how such accuracy was possible. Templar charts passed in secret might explain it. But there's another theory more haunting, that Genoa helped fragment the fleet, that ships arriving under cover of darkness were quietly divided, some absorbed into legitimate trade, others handed to rival powers. Some perhaps even sunk their crews, silenced, their cargo seized. All under the plausible deniability that Genoa had perfected. And yet not all traces were erased. A set of graffiti discovered in the 15th century undercroft of San Lorenzo Cathedral in Genoa includes a crude carving of a ship bearing the Templar cross alongside a single word in Latin "venditti" sold. Was it a confession, a warning, or just one last bitter whisper from a sailor who watched his brotherhood scattered by coins and contracts? You sit now at the edge of the old Genoese harbor. The bells ring in the distance. Water slaps against mooring posts long since worn smooth. A seagull lands nearby and watches you patient, hungry, as if waiting for a story to end. But this one doesn't end here. Because even in betrayal, the fleet moved forward. And sometimes the hands that helped you vanish are the same hands that made you visible again, under a different name. You climb now slowly through fog-thick heather and past low stone walls dotted with lichen the color of ash and sage. The wind here smells not of salt, but of peat smoke and rain. You are no longer near a grand port, no longer in a city of coin or conquest. This is the quiet country, windswept, forgotten, sacred in its own way. And scattered throughout its rolling grays and greens are old places, holy places. Monasteries, Ireland, Wales, Brittany. This is the path of the monastic West, and some say the final hiding ground of the fleet that vanished. It sounds almost quaint at first. Why would ships, massive, war-ready, ocean-crossing ships, end their journey in remote abbeys perched on cliffs and moors? But history teaches us to follow not only strength, but silence. And when the world turned hostile to the Templars, silence became more valuable than sails. Here's the historical truth. Throughout the High and Late Middle Ages, monastic communities, across the Atlantic-facing edges of Europe, served not only as centers of worship, but as hubs of literacy, storage, and discreet diplomacy. These monasteries had extensive guest quarters, hidden libraries, and underground storerooms. They kept charts, calendars, crates, and they kept secrets. One monastery in Brittany, Saint-Michel de Braspar, is documented as having received foreign brethren in 1308. The abbey's guest book, preserved in part on tattered vellum records, their stay as brief but solemn. They gave no names, wore dark cloaks, and left behind several sealed scrolls labeled only Testamentum. The pages are lost, but the record remains. There's an even more obscure entry in a 14th-century Irish psalter from the Glenstal Abbey region. In the margins of a prayer for travelers, a monk had scrawled in Latin sunt hic nautae Dei sed neque colorem nec nomen portant. Here are sailors of God, but they carry neither color nor name. The phrasing is odd. Not pilgrims, not priests, sailors, an anonymous piety. Monks are not often impressed by seafarers, but these were different. The controversial interpretation is that these monastic communities served as safe houses for Templar survivors and perhaps for pieces of the fleet's legacy. Think of it not as the fleet anchoring here, but filtering. Recall from earlier chapters the suggestion that the fleet splintered deliberately, some to Scotland, some to Portugal, some sailing west. But others may have crept into isolated harbors along the Irish Sea off the coasts of Cornwall or northern Brittany. Places where papal eyes didn't reach, where local lords answered first to abbots and second to kings. Consider Skellig Michael, the monastic island off Ireland's west coast. Its stone steps rise straight from the sea, its beehive cells carved into the cliff, like memories frozen in rock. Though abandoned as a full-time residence by the 14th century, there are rumors of temporary reoccupation, short bursts of life fires, lit doors, sealed again. Fishermen in the 15th century told of red lights burning at the island's peak, a signal no one could explain. Could this have been a contact point? A relay station, a place to store something that should not be seen. Open scholarly debate surrounds the question of relic concealment. Some believe the monastic West became the final resting place for sacred Templar artifacts, perhaps not gold, but scrolls, books, charts. If a treasure had to be hidden not from thieves but from the wrong interpreters, what better place than a silent abbey? Monks were keepers of words. They copied manuscripts for centuries. And the Templars knew this. Their own records were held not just in commanderies, but in affiliated religious institutions. So when the time came, and the fires grew close, the instinct would be to place those records where parchment survived longer than power. One fascinating callback rises from section 16, where we traced symbolic inscriptions in chapels. A particular motif, a circle with two crossing lines, appears again here. On the archway at the ruined Abbey of Llanthony in Wales, a stone block bears the same mark nearly worn away. But underneath it, in a different hand, scratched more crudely, are the letters RTF. Some say this stands for Rex Templarius Fugit, the Templar king has fled. It's more likely just graffiti. But it's graffiti written in Latin by someone who felt the need to preserve it. Another trace at the Abbey of Saint-Mathieu in Brittany, where the lighthouse now rises, a set of underground passages were sealed in the early 1300s. Their official function is unknown. A 19th century excavation revealed long corridors, wine casks empty, and a chest filled not with coin, but iron keys and parchment scraps. The scraps were illegible. The chest bore no crest, just a single word carved on its lid, memoria, memory. The callback to section 15 is gentle but unavoidable. The treasure may not have been gold at all, but knowledge. And here at the edge of Europe, that knowledge could be preserved, not in palaces, but in prayer. Of course, there are the skeptics. Some claim the monastic connection is mere romanticism, that monks took in weary sailors and nothing more, that any relics once entrusted to them have long since crumbled or been lost to fire war and reformation. But others, those who study patterns in stone and silence, see something else. In too many places, in too many borderlands, are references to unaccounted guests, locked rooms, and manuscripts written in hands not known to the scriptorium. And always, always there is a westward pull, the idea that those who stayed behind were not resting, but waiting. That the monastic cells were not tombs, but vaults. You stand now at the edge of a cliffside monastery in Wales, the wind biting but not cruel. The tide crashes below, echoing off rocks as old as language. Behind you a chapel door creaks open. Inside dust, votive candles, a cracked stone font filled with rainwater. You run your hand along the wall, and there it is, just visible in the light. A ship, carved low, pointed west. The fog comes in low, curling over the water like breath. You hear the creak of timber, the flap of sails in windless air. But there's nothing on the horizon, only the soft churn of waves and that strange, persistent sense that someone is watching from just beyond the mist. Not pirates, not smugglers, something older. Something that should no longer be here. And then you see it. A ship dark against the light gliding without wake. A red cross on a pale sail. No flag, no voice, no name. The Templars, they say, have returned. Or perhaps they never left. Stories of ghost ships are older than lighthouses. But beginning in the 14th century, just a few years after the supposed disappearance of the Templar fleet, those stories began to take on strange new forms. Not the standard tales of phantom galleons doomed to wander, but something more deliberate, more specific. Ships bearing the unmistakable Templar cross, crewed by silent men in faded tabards, ships that came and went without docking, without speaking. One of the earliest recorded sightings comes from 1332 off the coast of Galicia. A group of fishermen swore they saw a ship high and proud, its sail marked in crimson, though no oars touched water and no man stood at the helm. The report preserved in a parish record was dismissed at the time as superstition. But 3 nights later, another group saw the same vessel near Cape Finisterre. And a week after that, a similar description appears in a letter from a traveling merchant near Porto. All identical. All impossible. It didn't stop there. In 1395, a Breton nobleman claimed to have encountered a small flotilla of ships bearing crimson marks on pale banners moored quietly off the Ile de Seine. He approached by rowboat, but the ships pulled away in silence, their sails unfurled without crew. When he returned the next morning, they were gone and no tracks remained on the beach. His account, written in a personal diary, was not discovered until the 17th century, but it fits the pattern. What is the pattern? Red crosses, silent crews, no known port of origin, ships that move without resistance, and most of all, timing. Sightings often coincide with events of turmoil, wars, inquisitions, colonial failures. It's as if these vessels emerge not at random, but as warnings. The controversial interpretation, of course, is that these are not ghost stories at all, but coded messages. That for centuries after their dissolution, remnants of the Templar fleet remained active not in commerce, not in war, but in surveillance. Preservation. Their visibility was fleeting by design. A compelling example emerges in 1491 when a Genoese mariner named Sebastiano Marella claimed to have encountered a white vessel with no herald bearing old Crusader colors while returning from the Azores. He recorded the position. Days later, a Portuguese ship saw the same craft moving east. Morella's logbook was considered apocryphal for centuries until a copy surfaced in Lisbon's maritime archives, preserved as a curiosity. The callback here is subtle but significant. In Section 12, we explored the theory of Templar ships reaching the Americas. What if some had made the crossing and returned silent voyages? No port calls, no declarations, just eyes on the ocean. Watchmen. Another strange account comes from 1543 in a letter written by a Spanish monk traveling along the Galician coast. He describes a moment at dawn when villagers fled from the shoreline claiming that the Red Cross ships have returned. He saw nothing but reported unusual tides and smoke from no known fire. The villagers said they'd seen the ships before. Only when the world tilts, they said. Was it fear or was it memory? Skeptics dismiss all of this, of course. They argue that the Red Cross is a common symbol used by multiple orders and kingdoms, that ships fade from history not because they sail the mist, but because they rot and sink, that folklore grows around blank spaces, that ghost ships are ghost ships and nothing more. But there is one last set of sightings that defy even cynicism. In the early 17th century, off the coast of Newfoundland, Basque fishermen, among the first Europeans to work those remote waters, spoke of a silent vessel appearing near their hunting grounds. The ship bore unfamiliar rigging its sail marked with a crimson cross not of this world. Several logs repeat the detail. The ship approached no one. It moved against the wind. Decades later, Breton traders reported a similar vessel off Cape Breton Island. Again, no name, no flag, no explanation, just a presence. What do these accounts mean? An open scholarly debate asks whether these sightings are projections, myths born of longing for a lost age. Others argue that while the original fleet likely disappeared, its memory lingered in ritual sightings and communal imagination. But some believe a fragment of the fleet survived, that a handful of ships captained by men devoted to secrecy and purpose lived on. Perhaps they passed their knowledge from generation to generation, not through books, but through practice. That their routes, destinations, and missions changed with the centuries, but their symbol remained. A red cross, not to declare war, not to seek land, but to remember. The idea calls back to the quiet vaults of the Atlantic monasteries, to maps scratched into chapel walls, to symbols carved under altar stones. What if those were not just records of escape, but breadcrumbs for return because maybe the fleet never truly fled? Maybe it divided, drifted, dissolved. But maybe a few ships kept sailing, to bear witness, to wait. You stand now on a lonely beach in Brittany. The fog is thick, the tide rising. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, a bell rings once low and distant. You look out to sea and think not of treasure or glory, but of silence. Moving, watching, still out there. The wind has shifted again, not in direction, but in tone. It no longer carries whispers, but questions. Not fragments of rumor, but the weight of conclusion. And so you arrive slowly, carefully, at the final branch of the path, where every possibility must bend back to a single idea. Did the Templar fleet vanish in fear or in plan? The question is more than historical. It's psychological, philosophical. A retreat is reactive, a flight. But a final voyage, one calculated, mapped, and sealed in silence, that is something else. That is a choice, and choices leave fingerprints. You retrace them now. La Rochelle, the provisioning before the fall, the crates marked with symbols instead of names, the sudden absence from port ledgers, and then the silence. Not scattered, but structured. No wreckage, no shipwreck tales, no noble confiscations. Just a void too neat to be accidental. You remember the shadowy trails, Scotland, Portugal, the Isle of Mull, the Order of Christ and its peculiar continuity. The whispered codes in cathedral stones, the ships recarved into pews, the graffiti hidden beneath altars. Then the maps. The strange, too early outlines of unknown lands. And finally, the stories. Of red crosses seen centuries later gliding through fog eyes on the shore. And across every chapter, one theme echoes back: intent. This was not panic. This was preservation. The well-established historical fact often overlooked is this: the Templars, by their final decade, were no longer just warriors. They were stewards of land, of wealth, of ideas. They had become something more formidable than crusaders. They were keepers of continuity. That continuity didn't depend on castles or swords. It depended on movement, on adaptability, on ships. That's why the fleet matters so much. It wasn't just a means of escape, it was an arc. The controversial interpretation, one that divides historians, is that the fleet's disappearance was not the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one. That the Templars, seeing the writing on the wall, orchestrated their own dissolution. On land, they became martyrs. At sea, they became something else entirely. No longer knights, not yet myth. Something in between. One obscure but compelling fragment found in a Templar prayer book, buried beneath the convent of Christ in Tamar, reads simply, "Transitus non est fuga, sed mutatio." A crossing is not a flight, but a transformation. The phrase is nestled beside a passage from Exodus, where Moses leads his people not away from danger, but toward something veiled in cloud. Could that have been the true philosophy of the fleet's final journey? Some believe the Templars entrusted their most sacred artifacts not to any king or pope, but to the open sea, that they created a mobile sanctum, a sacred fleet, to carry what could not be held, that each ship had its own directive, that they split deliberately, one toward Scotland, one to Portugal, one west into legend. A callback now to the treasure theory from section 15. If the most valuable relics or texts were not hidden in vaults, but set adrift in moving fortresses, then the fleet itself was the hiding place. Destroy the fleet, and you destroy the knowledge. But divide it, scatter it, let it sail into forgetting. You make the trail nearly impossible to trace, but not entirely. The faint traces remain. In maps, in carvings, in whispers, in ships that seem to reappear long after they should have turned to rot, and perhaps even in names. Lineages that changed spelling but not purpose. Orders that shed old vows and took on new crests. There's one final record, thin as a spider's thread, from a Templar scribe in 1308. His document, half-burned, bears only 2 lines: "We did not fail. We dissolved ourselves. The sea carries what cannot be bound by stone." That is not a confession. It's a declaration. And so now you return one last time to the water's edge. The sky is slate gray, the tide low and restless. You kneel in the sand and draw a simple shape, a sail, a cross, a compass, and you understand. The final voyage wasn't an ending. It was a choice. The Templar fleet didn't disappear. It departed. You exhale slowly, letting the threads settle. The mist has cleared a little, not completely, but enough to trace outlines in the dark. You've wandered from fortress to coastline, from sealed catacombs to drifting silhouettes on the sea, and still the question flickers like a candle behind glass. What really happened to the Templar fleet, not what's been imagined. Not what's been whispered in wine-soaked taverns or dramatized in dusty documentaries, but what the evidence suggests carefully, quietly, when the legends are set aside. So let us weigh it. Gently. One fragment at a time. Begin with what is known. The fleet did exist. By 1307, the Knights Templar maintained a considerable number of ships. Cargo vessels, warships, coastal runners, all operated out of key ports, like La Rochelle, Marseille, and Acre before its fall. They had the infrastructure. They had trained crews. They had cargoes of immense and often unregistered value. We also know they had time. Historical records indicate that Philip IV's order to arrest the Templars was executed with urgency, but not secrecy. Word spread, enough at least to allow sensitive materials to be moved. Witnesses speak of carts loaded under cover of night, of monks receiving last-minute guests, of ships sailing days before any official crackdown. Then comes the silence. No ships seized, no fleets absorbed, no mass scuttling reported. The port ledgers meticulously maintained for decades go blank, and when voices re-emerge, they speak not in records, but in oddities, sudden refittings, anonymous ship leases, and strange sightings of vessels bearing no heraldry, yet possessing unmistakable confidence at sea. Here the theories bloom. Theory 1, dispersal, that the fleet fragmented intentionally, with parts of it reaching Scotland, Portugal, or even the Americas. This theory is bolstered by localized records, such as the guest registries at Tamar, the monastic graffiti in Mull, and the coded phrase, sealed cargo for the West. The continued rise of the Order of Christ and its exploration-forward agenda fits neatly here. Portugal didn't just absorb the Templars' properties, it inherited their momentum. Theory 2, camouflage. That the fleet was not hidden but rebranded. Ships with false names and foreign flags appear in Genoa, Venice, and the Western Mediterranean. Hulls match Templar design. Crews refuse inspection. Flags change. And so the fleet does not disappear. It becomes many fleets, many faces moving through ports too busy or too complicit to ask questions. Theory 3. Burial. That the most sacred or dangerous elements of the Templar legacy were not meant to be preserved through use, but through concealment. The Atlantic monasteries, the sealed vaults in Mull, the underground passages of Saint-Mathieu all point to a long game, not protection of wealth, but of truth. Scrolls, relics, ideas, hidden where only silence could keep them safe. Theory 4, voyage beyond. The most romantic and yet the most difficult to dismiss outright. That a portion of the fleet sailed west, not just into myth, but into memory. The stories from Nova Scotia, the cross-carvings in Newfoundland, the anomalous maps showing American coastlines before discovery, all hint at movement across the ocean. And the strange ships seen centuries later. Perhaps they were echoes, or continuations. Now consider the counterweight, the skeptics. They argue the Templars were overestimated, that their fleet was smaller, less organized, less significant, that the ships were sold off quietly or simply fell into disrepair, that no records remain because the order collapsed into chaos. that the ghost ships are misidentified, the carvings wishful, the graffiti coincidental. They may be right about some things, but what they cannot explain is the precision of the silence. The way records vanish not haphazardly, but methodically. The consistency of the roots. The deliberate reuse of certain phrases in unrelated regions. The westward orientation of ship carvings. The resurrection of Templar maritime strategy under other names, in other banners, in exactly the places the fleet might have landed. And so we are left not with certainty, but with weighted probability. The evidence across document sightings, architecture, and timing suggests the fleet did not vanish randomly. It was not destroyed. It was not forgotten. It was repurposed. Whether that purpose was preservation, exploration, or something more spiritual, the pattern is unmistakable. This was not the collapse of a maritime empire. It was its metamorphosis. A callback arises soft and final from Section 23 Transitus non est fuga sed mutatio. A crossing is not a flight, but a transformation. The Templar fleet may not have sailed into exile. It may have sailed into evolution. You close the final page of the ledger. The numbers no longer matter. The red crosses have faded from the sails, but the shape remains. You walk out from the crypt, the cloister, the shoreline, and still just over the horizon behind the veil of history, the fleet waits. So now at last you sit with the waves, not as a seeker, not as an investigator, not even as a storyteller, just still, listening, watching. There is no trail left to follow, no parchment to unfold, no symbol to decode. Only the ocean stretched out in every direction, whispering the same rhythm it whispered long before the Templars raised a single sail. It does not offer conclusions. It offers echoes. You breathe in the salt. Let it fill your lungs. Let it settle where questions used to stir. The fleet that vanished, that scattered, that perhaps never truly left, remains adrift in the folds of time. Maybe it broke apart. Maybe it changed names. Maybe it carried truth or treasure or just the quiet resolve of men choosing exile over surrender. You've walked their paths, stood at their thresholds, touched the stones where they may have prayed, and still the answer is not in the documents. It's in the distance. Not every mystery closes its doors behind you. Some stay ajar. Purposefully, like a ship moored just offshore, half seen, half felt. The Templar fleet may never reveal itself, not because it cannot be found, but because it was never meant to be. Some stories aren't solved. They're lived. And as you drift, so does the final truth. Not buried, not broken, just carried. By wind, by wave, by time. The sea remembers, but it does not explain. It keeps, and that is enough.